Welcome to the family reunion from history's fever dream. Bring a crown, not a casserole. We're about to wander through the velvet-draped corridors of royal eccentricity, where bloodlines get tangled, court rituals get ridiculous, and personal quirks become national policy. It's a place where a bad hair day might be declared treason, and where the family squabbles aren't just awkward, they start wars. Now, before we start naming names, and oh, we will, let's ask the bigger question. Why do royal families get so weird? Is it the centuries of inbreeding, the suffocating court etiquette, the fact that when you're told from birth you're chosen by God, you stop worrying about whether your hobby of collecting taxidermy lobsters might be a tad unusual? Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, the weirdest royal families in history, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Here's the thing about absolute power. It's a petri dish for eccentricity. Imagine living in a palace so big you can get lost on your way to the bathroom, surrounded by servants whose entire career depends on telling you your latest gold-embroidered cape is simply breathtaking. Your Majesty, no one says no to you, not even when you decide that all royal portraits must include a miniature version of your favorite dog, balanced on your scepter. Isolation makes it worse. Royals often grew up in carefully curated bubbles, shielded from the common folk like rare orchids. Every outing was orchestrated. Every friend was vetted, and every piece of news passed through layers of courtiers who would rather spin a famine as a brisk harvest diet than risk upsetting the sovereign. When your reality is edited for your comfort, you can start to believe that the world really does revolve around your breakfast preferences. Speaking of breakfast, in some royal courts, there were entire ceremonies devoted to watching the monarch eat. Imagine trying to enjoy your eggs while 40 people stand in silence, evaluating your fork technique like Olympic judges. Royal rituals started out with purpose, coronations, religious blessings, treaties, but over time they tended to accumulate layers of unnecessary theatre. It wasn't enough for the king to receive an ambassador. He had to receive him while wearing exactly 32 pearls on a Tuesday, facing east, after being ceremonially dusted with swan feathers. One monarch insisted that his boots be blessed before he wore them. Another believed that touching a royal handkerchief could cure illness. Spoiler, it did not. And then there was the king, who decreed that no one could look at him directly unless he was in full ceremonial dress, which meant surprise visits were out, but elaborate waiting room experiences were very much in. Rituals weren't just for pomp, they were tools of control. The more elaborate the protocol, the more it reminded everyone of the monarch's special status. You can't overthrow someone if you're still trying to remember whether you're supposed to bow 3 times or 4 before speaking. A king wasn't just a person, he was an idea, and that idea had to be protected, polished, and occasionally embellished. In ancient and medieval courts, it was common for a ruler's image to be part truth, part public relations magic. If a monarch was short, official portraits might depict them towering over their enemies. If they had a limp, poems would describe them as walking with divine gravity. And if they were prone to poor decision-making, well, that's just mystical unpredictability. The most ridiculous justification ever recorded? A king once declared that his fondness for excessive drinking was actually part of a sacred duty. He claimed he was sharing in the suffering of the vine. Essentially, I'm not drunk, I'm holy. These myths weren't just vanity projects, they were survival tools. In an age when rebellion was always one famine away, convincing the public you were divinely appointed, supernaturally lucky, or somehow related to a famous hero could keep the pitchforks at bay. Power doesn't just breed oddities, it can make cruelty look respectable. Some royal traditions were essentially just socially acceptable ways of eliminating rivals. Ritualized duels, ceremonial imprisonments, or convenient religious accusations were all part of the playbook. Of course, no one called it murder. They called it ensuring stability or upholding sacred law. It's amazing how many questionable acts can be justified with the right ceremonial hat. Once a royal quirk makes it into tradition, it's almost impossible to remove. Generations might pass before anyone questions why the king's breakfast eggs must be blessed by a left-handed monk, or why the queen always rides a goat during spring festivals. By the time someone suggests changing it, the answer is usually, "But we've always done it this way." This is how eccentricities calcify into culture, and it's why we can look back now and find entire dynasties whose reputations are built less on their political achievements and more on their strange personal habits. Coming up, we're going to meet families who turned eccentricity into an art form, sometimes harmless, sometimes dangerous, occasionally both at once. From dynasties that tied themselves into literal genetic knots, to rulers who trusted psychics more than generals, to courts where the definition of entertainment would make a modern audience scream. We're taking the scenic route through the Royal Hall of Weird, so settle in. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? By the end of this, you might wish you could unlearn some of the mental images I'm about to give you. Their family tree was less a tree and more an elaborate keep-it-in-the-house wreath. The Habsburgs were one of history's most powerful dynasties, and they didn't get there by sheer luck or battlefield brilliance alone. They built an empire through marriage, not just the romantic kind, which was questionable in their case, but marriages as strategic political maneuvers. To the Habsburg mind, alliances were better forged in chapels than on battlefields. Why risk losing a war when you could just marry the person who owns the territory you want? It was diplomacy without the bloodshed. Well, without the battlefield bloodshed at least. This strategy worked spectacularly for centuries. By the mid-16th century, the Habsburgs controlled huge swaths of Europe, from Spain and Portugal to Austria, Hungary, the Low Countries, and even chunks of Italy. They didn't even have to conquer much of it. Instead, they accumulated countries the way some people collect fridge magnets. A wedding here, a dowry there, and suddenly your personal map starts looking like an entire continent. Their motto could have been, "Why fight when we can wed?" And honestly, it worked. At first. The problem with building an empire through marriages to your own cousins is that after a few centuries, your gene pool starts to resemble a decorative puddle. The Habsburgs took the idea of close family to levels that would make a modern geneticist faint. Cousin married cousin, uncle married niece. In one case, double first cousins married each other, meaning their family lines were already twice tangled before the wedding even happened. This was seen not as alarming, but as a perfectly sensible way to keep the royal blood pure. They called it preserving lineage. We might call it reckless DNA recycling. And then there was the jaw. The infamous Habsburg jaw was the dynasty's most recognizable hereditary feature. A prominent lower jaw and protruding lip that artists sometimes downplayed in portraits, and sometimes didn't. Over generations it became more pronounced. So much so that later Habsburgs struggled with chewing and speaking. It wasn't just a cosmetic quirk, it was a physical reminder of just how tightly they had been marrying within the family. For Charles II of Spain, the jaw was only one of many problems. Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, was the genetic end product of 2 centuries of marital shortcuts. Born with severe health issues, he was often sick, struggled to walk unaided until he was 4, and was described by contemporaries as having difficulty speaking and swallowing. The poor man became king at age 4, and somehow reigned for decades, though his court spent much of that time debating whether his poor health was the result of witchcraft, a curse, or divine punishment. No one in power wanted to admit that the problem might be the family's habit of using the same surnames for both bride and groom. Still, the Habsburg strategy of marriage diplomacy wasn't all genetic doom. For centuries, it created a patchwork of alliances that made the family the central political player of Europe. They managed to keep the Ottoman Empire at bay, influence the papacy, and broker peace in major conflicts, all while throwing lavish weddings that doubled as high-stakes negotiations. A marriage contract in Habsburg Europe could be as significant as a peace treaty, and often more enduring, unless of course someone failed to produce an heir. In that case, the peace was over and the war drums started. The dynasty also had a flair for ceremony. A Habsburg wedding was not a private family affair. It was a public display of power, wealth, and territorial ambition. Guests might travel for weeks to attend, and the celebrations could stretch on for days with feasts, tournaments, plays, and fireworks. Beneath the glitter, however, these weddings were often between people who already knew each other uncomfortably well from family gatherings. Imagine a bride and groom whose parents had literally been in the same delivery room, and you're getting close to the Habsburg norm. By the 17th century, the flaws in the system were showing. The genetic consequences of repeated inbreeding, coupled with declining political influence, began to weaken the family's dominance. Charles II's inability to produce an heir led to the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive European conflict that essentially decided who would inherit the vast Habsburg-controlled lands. The dynasty that had built its empire with wedding rings now faced the reality that the same strategy had led to its downfall. And yet, the Habsburgs didn't exactly disappear. The Austrian branch continued to rule into the 20th century, presiding over the Austro-Hungarian Empire until its collapse after World War I. Even today, descendants still exist, many of them perfectly healthy, thanks to a more modern approach to choosing a spouse. The jaw, however, remains an enduring symbol in history textbooks of what happens when you mix politics, power, and a strict marry-only-in-the-family policy. Their legacy is a fascinating mix of achievement and absurdity. Rulers who commanded continents, dictated European politics, and yet couldn't quite bring themselves to widen the family dating pool. In a way, they're the ultimate example of how short-term gains can spiral into long-term problems, and how a diplomatic strategy can become a genetic cautionary tale. They may have believed they were building the perfect royal line, but in the end, the Habsburg story is a reminder that even empires can collapse under the weight of their own wedding invitations. In that court, the fastest route to the top was not a victory flag, it was getting your sibling politely retired. The Ottoman Empire, at its height, was one of the largest and most sophisticated states in history, stretching across 3 continents, blending cultures from the Balkans to Arabia. But behind the vast military victories and glittering trade routes, the palace politics of Istanbul were as sharp as any scimitar. The beating heart of this intrigue was the Topkapi Palace, a sprawling complex overlooking the Bosporus, where marble courtyards met tiled chambers and where the air carried the scent of incense, garden blooms, and the constant low hum of whispered plans. The palace wasn't just a residence, it was a city within a city, housing the Sultan, his extended family, his household staff, high-ranking officials, and an army of eunuchs who kept the machinery of power running smoothly and discreetly. To understand the unique brand of Ottoman royal politics, you have to start with succession. In the early centuries, there was no eldest son inherits policy. Instead, the throne went to whichever male member of the dynasty could take it and keep it. The unspoken rule was brutal. If you became sultan, you eliminated your brothers. This wasn't metaphorical elimination. It was actual, hands-on, silk cord strangulation, quick, quiet, and, in the palace view, more dignified than beheading. The official reasoning: it prevented civil war. The unofficial reality: it also kept your mother from having to awkwardly make conversation at family dinners with the guy plotting your overthrow. By the 17th century, the Ottomans shifted to a less bloody but still deeply unsettling system, the cafes, or cage. This was not a literal iron bar prison, but a suite of rooms within the palace where potential heirs were kept under close watch. Imagine being a prince and spending decades in this gilded isolation, surrounded by tutors, servants, and guards, but never allowed to step beyond a small section of the palace grounds. You could study poetry, religion, and military history, but you could not participate in actual governance, nor see the empire you might one day rule. Some princes entered the cafes as children and emerged in middle age, summoned to the throne after a brother's death. This meant the new sultan might be completely unprepared for leadership, having last seen the outside world when he was too young to remember it. It was an odd gamble. Better to have a sheltered, inexperienced sultan than risk a bloody fight for the throne. The result? rulers who sometimes treated the empire more like a classroom exercise than a political reality. While the Sultan technically held supreme power, in practice the palace's inner workings were heavily influenced and sometimes outright controlled by the women of the imperial harem, especially the valied sultan, the sultan's mother. She was not a passive figure in a corner. She was the most politically powerful woman in the empire, often acting as an advisor, diplomat, and kingmaker. Her network of alliances within the harem and among the court eunuchs could make or break ministers, direct foreign policy, and decide who in the family would rise or fall. And then there were the eunuchs themselves, particularly the chief black eunuch, who controlled access to the sultan and the harem. His role was both logistical and political, overseeing palace security, managing correspondence, and serving as a gatekeeper between the sultan and anyone who wanted an audience. If the valid sultan was the palace's quiet strategist, the chief eunuch was its unblinking guard tower. The harem itself was far from the Western fantasy of a pleasure palace. It was a strictly organized, highly regulated institution, where women were ranked by seniority, beauty, and political usefulness. Many were slaves brought from distant lands, converted to Islam, and educated in language, etiquette, and the fine art of palace politics. A favored concubine could rise to extraordinary influence if she bore the sultan a son, but she also stepped into a dangerous arena where rivals might scheme for her removal. In this world, gifts, whispered promises, and subtle insults carried as much weight as armies. Life in the palace was a constant negotiation between the official rituals of the Ottoman court and the unofficial web of alliances, bribes, and private favors that determined who had the sultan's ear. The grand public ceremonies, processions, feasts, religious festivals were dazzling performances meant to project stability and divine authority. But behind the tiled walls, power shifted in smaller, quieter ways. A private conversation in a shaded corridor, a letter delivered in the night, a subtle change in who poured the sultan's coffee. And yet, for all its intrigue, the system worked for centuries. The Ottomans managed to maintain a vast, multi-ethnic empire, adapt to shifting trade routes, and survive repeated military challenges. The palace, with all its cages and silk cords, was the engine that kept the dynasty intact, even if it occasionally produced sultans better suited to poetry recitals than political crisis management. In the end, the Ottoman system was a paradox. It was designed to prevent bloodshed in succession, but it was born from a history of fratricide. It kept heirs safe from political enemies, but in doing so it kept them safe from experience too, and it concentrated immense influence in the hands of people who never officially sat on the throne. Mothers, concubines, eunuchs, proving that in the Ottoman court, real power didn't always wear the crown. They consulted mystics the way some people check the weather app. Constantly, and with trembling, the Romanov dynasty ruled Russia for over 300 years, projecting an image of divine right and unshakable authority. But by the early 20th century, the family lived in a world so insulated, so sealed off from the realities of their crumbling empire, that when trouble came knocking, they answered the door with incense and prayers instead of reform. The Romanovs' imperial isolation was not just physical, though the imperial residences at Tsarskoye Selo and the Winter Palace were worlds away from the streets of St. Petersburg. It was mental too. Tsar Nicholas II and his family lived in a carefully curated bubble, surrounded by courtiers and advisors who filtered what news reached their ears. Peasant uprisings were small disturbances. Military disasters were temporary setbacks. Starving citizens were awaiting the next harvest. The outside world seeped in only through reports that had been polished until they sparkled. And within this bubble, superstition found fertile ground. Alexandra Feodorovna, the German-born empress, was particularly inclined towards spiritualism, mysticism, and religious visions. This was not unusual in late imperial Russia. The country was alive with prophets, seers, and wandering holy men who promised to heal the sick and predict the future. But Alexandra's devotion to one in particular would prove disastrous: Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a Siberian peasant-turned mystic, a man with hypnotic eyes, questionable hygiene, and a knack for convincing people he was chosen by God. When the imperial couple's only son, Alexei, was born with hemophilia, a life-threatening condition where the blood doesn't clot properly, Rasputin's reputation as a healer became their lifeline. He seemed, at least in their eyes, to ease the boy's suffering during bleeding episodes. Whether this was the result of actual skill, hypnotic suggestion, or sheer coincidence remains debated, but to Alexandra it was a miracle. And when you think someone has literally saved your child's life, you don't stop to ask about their personal boundaries, political motives, or tendency to hang out in questionable company. Before long, Rasputin had become a fixture at court, advising not only on Alexei's health, but on political appointments and state matters. Ministers were dismissed or promoted based on his whispered recommendations. His enemies claimed he was corrupt, licentious, and drunk on both alcohol and power. His supporters painted him as a misunderstood holy man, unfairly maligned by jealous elites. Either way, his presence became a public scandal, feeding rumors that the empire was being run by a disheveled mystic and an overly pious empress. Nicholas, ever the dutiful husband, stood by Alexandra's judgment, but his own political instincts were hardly sharper. His reign had already been rocked by the 1905 revolution, which forced him into granting a parliament, a concession he later undermined by limiting its power. Then came World War I, where his decision to take direct command of the Russian army left the capital under Alexandra's influence and Rasputin's shadow. Military defeats piled up, soldiers deserted, food shortages worsened, and the gap between the Romanovs' perception of reality and the actual state of Russia became a chasm. Meanwhile, Rasputin's enemies decided that removing him was the only way to save the monarchy. In December 1916, a group of nobles lured him to a late-night gathering, supposedly for drinks and conversation. Accounts of his death have grown into near myth: poisoned wine, gunshots, beatings, a final escape attempt, and drowning in the icy Neva. How much is truth and how much is legend remains uncertain, but Rasputin's demise did nothing to repair the monarchy's reputation. If anything, it made the imperial family seem even more vulnerable and isolated, cut off from the very people they needed to win over. The following year, the February Revolution swept Nicholas from the throne. The family was placed under house arrest, first in their beloved Tsarskoye Selo, later moved to Tobolsk in Siberia, and finally to Ekaterinburg. The days of glittering balls and gilded carriages were gone, replaced by cold rooms, plain food, and the watchful eyes of revolutionary guards. They still clung to the hope of rescue, perhaps from monarchist forces, perhaps from foreign allies. But as months passed, it became clear no one was coming. In July 1918, in the basement of the Ipatiev house, the last chapter of the Romanovs' rule ended in gunfire. The execution was messy, chaotic, and final. Yet their death sparked one of history's most enduring myths, that one or more of the children had survived. Over the decades, impostors would step forward claiming to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia or other siblings, their stories sometimes convincing enough to gain international attention before being debunked. DNA testing in the late 20th and early 21st centuries finally confirmed the fate of the family, but the allure of a surviving Romanov remains part of popular imagination. The Romanov story is a cautionary tale of how an empire can unravel when its rulers live in a world of selective truths, spiritual shortcuts, and misplaced trust. Their belief that divine providence or the right holy man could protect them from political disaster proved to be their undoing. In the end, the empire they ruled for centuries collapsed not just from external pressures, but from the brittle shell of illusion they had built around themselves. But if you've ever watched a soap opera and thought, well, that's unrealistic, the Ptolemaic dynasty would like to have a word. Or rather, a royal decree delivered in Greek with Egyptian hieroglyphics on the side for the local audience. The Ptolemies weren't native Egyptians at all. They were Macedonian Greeks, descended from Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's most loyal generals. When Alexander died, his empire split like a cracked amphora, and Ptolemy grabbed Egypt, But here's the twist. Rather than ruling like foreign conquerors, the Ptolemies slipped into pharaonic robes faster than you can say divine kingship, even if they had to learn the religion on the fly, and they really learnt it. These rulers staged themselves as living gods, just like the old pharaohs, but added a dash of Greek theatre for flair. Temples became as much PR venues as religious centres, decorated with scenes of the ruler making offerings to Horus, Isis and Ra, even if their Greek accents probably made the priests wince. The fusion worked politically, at least at first. Egyptians saw familiar divine imagery. Greeks saw their rulers holding on to their Hellenistic heritage. It was the political equivalent of speaking two languages at once and hoping neither side noticed your grammatical mistakes. But the Ptolemies weren't content with merely borrowing customs. They also imported one very old, very royal tradition from elsewhere in the ancient world, keeping royal marriages in the family. And they took it literally. Full-blood siblings marrying each other wasn't just tolerated, it was official policy. This wasn't because Tinder was slow in ancient Alexandria. It was about consolidating power, preventing the dilution of divine blood, and keeping the throne away from ambitious outsiders. Of course, it also led to a royal family tree that looked more like a tightly wound wreath, with branches looping back onto themselves in dizzying repetition. Inside the palace, family dinners must have been tense. Rivalry between siblings, spouses, and co-rulers often turned lethal. The Ptolemaic court had the energy of a Greek tragedy written by someone who thought the ending wasn't tragic enough. Poisonings, staged assassinations, and suspicious accidents were practically seasonal events. More than one Ptolemaic queen decided that the easiest way to ensure loyalty was to remove a rival entirely, preferably with a knife, cup of wine, or a strategically timed crocodile encounter. The most famous of them all, Cleopatra VII, inherited this volatile tradition but made it her own. Cleopatra is often remembered for her alliances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, but before the Roman drama came into play, she had already co-ruled with and married her younger brothers, two different Ptolemies under the watchful eye of tradition. These partnerships were less about romantic unity and more about joint PR campaigns, brother and sister standing together in temple carvings, presenting offerings to the gods, while in reality plotting against each other in private chambers. Still, Cleopatra mastered the blend of Greek intellect and Egyptian spectacle. She spoke multiple languages, participated in religious rituals with the precision of a seasoned pharaoh, and staged her own image as both a goddess and a scholar. Her arrival to meet Antony in Tarsus wasn't just a romantic episode. It was a pharaonic-style propaganda parade. Golden barge, scented sails, servants dressed as gods. This was PR with papyrus-perfect execution, calculated to awe both Egyptian subjects and Roman generals. But beneath the gold and incense, the dynasty was cracking. Years of inbreeding had produced rulers who were sometimes more suited to palace intrigue than competent governance. Civil unrest simmered, and Egypt's once strong economy sagged under heavy taxation and constant wars. Worse, the Ptolemies had tied their fortunes to Rome's, first as allies and then as pawns in the larger game of Mediterranean politics. Every marriage, alliance and diplomatic move was made with an eye on the Senate's mood swings. By Cleopatra's time, Egypt's independence was more illusion than reality. Her famous relationships with Caesar and Antony weren't just personal, they were desperate bids to secure Egypt's autonomy. When Antony fell at Actium and Cleopatra staged her legendary suicide, she wasn't just ending her own life, she was closing the final act of a 300-year-long drama. The Ptolemaic dynasty was replaced by Roman provincial governance, and the pharaoh's crown went into the Museum of History. Even so, their legacy endures in monuments, coins, and the sheer theatricality of their rule. They managed for centuries to convince two very different cultures that they were the rightful divine rulers of both, and they did it while hosting what might be history's most complicated family reunions, complete with matching crowns, shared parents, and enough betrayal to fill an entire season of a movie. They treated keeping it in the family like a state policy with sarcophagi on standby. And if nothing else, they proved that in politics, a little spectacle can keep the audience watching, at least until the final curtain falls. In the dark, snow-laden hills of early 17th century Hungary, the name Bathory didn't just open doors, it made people step back. This noble family had produced soldiers, statesmen and rulers, but history remembers one name above all, Elizabeth Bathory, the so-called Blood Countess. According to later tales, she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. According to more sober historians, that's the stretch. A big theatrical, gossip-fueled stretch, but legends, like stubborn wine stains, have a way of sticking. Elizabeth was born in 1560 into a family so politically connected they practically owned the social ladder. The Bathorys held vast estates, claimed seats of power in Hungary and Transylvania, and had the kind of influence that made enemies as easily as friends. At 15, she married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a man more interested in waging war against the Ottomans than in household affairs. Elizabeth managed the estates, which, if you've ever dealt with 16th century Hungarian peasants, meant overseeing agriculture, trade, and the occasional small-scale rebellion. The trouble began after her husband's death in 1604. Suddenly, the widowed countess was a wealthy, independent noblewoman with no male protector. In the rigid patriarchy of the time, that was like painting a giant target on your forehead. Rumors began to swirl at first about her temper, then her cruelty towards servants, and finally about, well, the bloodbaths. One popular story claimed that after striking a maid hard enough to draw blood, Elizabeth noticed her skin looked smoother where the drop had landed. From there, the tale snowballed into a gothic horror worthy of Bram Stoker's Notebook. But here's where the politics seep in like damp through castle walls. Much of the evidence against Elizabeth comes from trial records taken after her arrest in 1610. These records were gathered under dubious circumstances, often from witnesses who'd been tortured. Their testimonies ballooned her victim count into the hundreds, which is historically suspect for several reasons. For one thing, a rural Hungarian estate would have run out of peasant girls long before reaching 650 bodies. For another, mass murder on that scale tends to leave behind a bit more physical evidence than gossip and inconsistent testimonies. It's also worth noting who stood to benefit from her downfall. King Matthias II owed Elizabeth a considerable sum of money. Confiscating her lands and wealth would solve that problem neatly. Noble rivals eyed her estates like starving men at a banquet, and her status as a powerful woman without a husband made her an easy target for scandal. In other words, while Elizabeth may indeed have been harsh, cruel, or even sadistic toward her servants, hardly unheard of among nobles, the bloodbath legend was likely embroidered for political convenience. The trial's outcome was telling. Rather than executing her, which might have stirred unrest, authorities walled her up inside her castle at Szeged. No public burning, no beheading, just a quiet, drawn-out imprisonment until her death in 1614. It was a neat solution. The problem vanished, and the property changed hands without messy public martyrdom. And yet Elizabeth's afterlife in folklore has been anything but quiet. The 18th and 19th centuries saw a resurgence of her story, just as Gothic literature was exploding across Europe. Writers recast her as a vampiric figure, feeding off innocence to preserve her beauty, a deliciously unsettling image that dovetailed perfectly with emerging vampire myths in Eastern Europe. By the time she made it into modern horror media, the details had been polished into a bloody jewel: the noble woman's vanity, the secret chambers, the dripping corpses, the endless baths of crimson. This is where the Bathory legend becomes a case study in how history and myth intertwine. On one hand, she might have been a violent, abusive noble, hardly an angel, certainly no role model. On the other hand, the extreme elements of her story likely tell us more about early modern politics, misogyny, and the way societies construct monsters than about Elizabeth herself. In that sense, she's less the female Dracula and more a victim of a PR campaign from hell, one that's lasted 4 centuries. The irony: the real Countess Bathory probably wouldn't recognize herself in these lurid tales, but if bloodline were a brand, Hers came with a really bad marketing campaign. Today, she's immortal in a way her political enemies could never have imagined, not as a landowner or noble woman, but as a villainess in countless horror films, novels, and heavy metal lyrics. In death, she became the very thing 17th century men feared most, a woman who could live forever. If you ever thought your family dinners were awkward, you've clearly never attended a Borgia banquet. Picture it. Candlelit halls in Renaissance Rome, guests sipping wine while mentally calculating the odds that it's laced with arsenic, all under the benevolent gaze of Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, whose version of fatherly love often came with a political appointment and a side of scandal. The Borgias were the ultimate power family of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, wielding influence in both sacred and secular realms. Their idea of Sunday dinner, a menu, a coup, and maybe a suspicious canapé. Rodrigo Borgia's papacy 1492-1503 was less about quiet prayer and more about orchestrating a dynastic empire from the Vatican itself. He openly favored his illegitimate children, a move that shocked exactly no one in an era when clerical celibacy was more of a polite suggestion than a binding vow. His son Cesare Borgia rose from cardinal to military commander in record time, while his daughter Lucrezia Borgia became infamous for her supposed beauty, cunning, and knack for surviving the Italian marriage market, often arranged by dear old dad. This was nepotism elevated to an art form, gilded in papal robes and backed by an army. The rumors, though, are what turned the Borgias into household names, whispered in courts from Florence to Paris. Tales of poison rings, perfumed murder, and shadowy banquets traveled faster than any official decree. According to gossip, the Borgias kept a special poison called cantarella, allegedly served in wine or on sweetmeats to eliminate inconvenient rivals. Reality check. While political assassinations weren't exactly rare in Renaissance Italy, concrete evidence of Borgia poison plots is surprisingly thin. But in the Renaissance rumor economy, thin evidence was just another way of saying excellent story material. Cesare Borgia in particular seemed ripped from a political thriller. He was charismatic, ruthless, and very good at making his enemies disappear, sometimes literally. Machiavelli himself admired Cesare's audacity, holding him up as the model prince in The Prince. Caesar's military campaigns, particularly in the Romagna region, were marked by strategic brilliance and brutal efficiency. He rewarded loyalty, crushed betrayal, and treated treachery as a personal insult. It's little wonder his name became shorthand for calculated ambition. Then there was Lucrezia, the Renaissance's most famous femme fatale, at least in the popular imagination. She was accused of everything from incest to orchestrating murders via poisoned chalices. The truth? Much of her dark reputation seems to have been the product of hostile political propaganda. Contemporary records suggest she was often a pawn in her family's political chess game, married off to forge alliances and then quietly maneuvered into new unions when those alliances soured. She was well educated, a patron of the arts, and by the standards of the day, a capable administrator in her own right. But shrewd noblewoman managing estates doesn't quite have the same tabloid appeal as murderous seductress. What made the Borgias particularly scandalous wasn't just their alleged misdeeds, it was the fact that they were doing all this while sitting in the highest spiritual office in Christendom. The papacy was supposed to embody moral authority, not throw family reunions that looked like the pilot episode of Game of Thrones. Rival Italian families, like the Medicis and the Sforzas, seized on this hypocrisy, feeding salacious stories to anyone who would listen. Ambassadors wrote home with juicy dispatches. Poets and pamphleteers turned rumors into literary gold. The result was a reputation that blurred the line between history and theatre. Renaissance Rome was a stage, and the Borgias played their parts with such flair that it became impossible to separate fact from performance. Did they poison their rivals? Maybe, but so did plenty of other families who didn't get immortalized in countless novels, plays, and television dramas. What made the Borgias stand out was the combination of papal legitimacy, unapologetic ambition, and the sheer entertainment value of the stories told about them. Even art got in on the act. Portraits of the family, though often flattering, carried a certain edge. Caesare's piercing eyes, Lucrezia's serene smile, Rodrigo's imperious stance. To contemporaries, these images hinted at secrets beneath the surface. The Vatican's opulence became a visual metaphor for the family's wealth and rumored decadence. By the time Alexander VI died in 1503, likely of malaria, though conspiracy theorists had their doubts, the Borgia myth was firmly entrenched. Caesare's fortunes collapsed soon after, undone by political shifts and his own overreach. Lucrezia retired to Ferrara, where she reinvented herself as a respected duchess and patron of the arts, a far cry from the femme fatale of legend. The Borgias remind us that in politics, image is everything, and once a story is scandalous enough, it takes on a life of its own. Their enemies understood this perfectly, weaponizing rumor as effectively as any army. And while history may have softened some of the more sensational claims, the combination of Renaissance intrigue, papal power, and family ambition ensured that the Borgias would live forever, not in the annals of sainthood, but in the much more crowded halls of infamy. If the Renaissance taught us anything, it's that power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, and papal power corrupts with better catering. If history were a stage play, the Mughal Empire's royal family would be the troupe that insisted on performing Shakespeare with real swords. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, these emperors and empresses ruled over a vast and wealthy empire, stretching across most of the Indian subcontinent, building wonders like the Taj Mahal while ensuring that palace intrigue remained a blood sport. It was a world where emeralds the size of pigeon eggs glittered beside plates of spiced lamb, and where the man sitting across from you at dinner might be your brother or your executioner by morning. The Mughal dynasty was famed for its splendor, jeweled thrones, intricate gardens, and architecture that made European visitors weak at the knees. Their courts smelled of rosewater and cardamom, their halls shimmered with inlaid semi-precious stones. But if you walked those corridors too confidently, you might accidentally overhear a whispered plot and end up in the wrong side of the family discussion, which, in Mughal terms, meant war. Succession was never neat. Unlike Europe's primogeniture system, where the eldest son usually got the crown, the Mughal throne was open to whoever was ambitious and armed enough to take it. That meant when an emperor died, or even hinted at being unwell, his sons sharpened their swords, mustered their armies, and let the rivers run red. It was like a recurring family reunion where the entertainment was civil war. Take the infamous War of Succession in the 1650s. Shah Jahan, the emperor who built the Taj Mahal, fell seriously ill. His 4 sons Dara Shikoh, Aurangzeb, Murad Bakhsh, and Shah Shuja did not gather around his bed with flowers. Instead, they split into camps, each claiming divine right and military superiority. Dara Shikoh, the intellectual favorite, dreamed of uniting Hindu and Muslim thought. Aurangzeb, devout and calculating, dreamed of uniting the empire under his own absolute control. Murad Bakhsh dreamed of glory and possibly just not being last place. When the dust settled, Aurangzeb had outmaneuvered them all. Dara was executed, Murad was imprisoned, and Shah Shuja vanished into the historical shadows. And Shah Jahan, his loving son Aurangzeb, put him in a gilded prison in Agra Fort for the last 8 years of his life, with a window view of the Taj Mahal, a daily reminder of both his greatest creation and the wife he built it for. In the Mughal Empire, even house arrest came with tasteful landscaping. It's easy to imagine the Taj Mahal as purely a romantic gesture, and to be fair, it is arguably the most beautiful I miss you note in history, built between 1632 and 1648 as a mausoleum for Shah Jahan's beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal. The white marble monument is inlaid with thousands of semi-precious stones, from lapis lazuli to turquoise. But this wasn't just a love story, it was also a statement. The Mughals had both the wealth and the artisans to outshine any rival kingdom. And yet the grandeur masked a tragedy. The labor force that built the Taj numbered in the tens of thousands, and the cost strained the empire's treasury. By the time it was finished, the political tides were shifting, Aurangzeb was plotting, and the very man who built it would never visit it as a free emperor again. While Mughal history often focuses on the men swinging swords, some of its most fascinating power players wore silk instead of armor. Chief among them was Nur Jahan, the wife of Emperor Jahangir, sharp-witted, politically astute, and utterly fearless. She effectively ran the empire during her husband's reign, issuing imperial orders, minting coins in her own name, and even negotiating with foreign dignitaries. Her enemies whispered that she was a schemer, her allies praised her as a savior, and everyone agreed she had an iron will wrapped in perfume and pearls. In a world where most royal women were confined to palace walls, Nur Jahan strode through court politics like a seasoned general, proof that Mughal intrigue was not a male-only sport. Mughal emperors weren't content to just keep the throne, they needed to justify it. This meant elaborate public ceremonies, generous patronage of the arts, and for some, an aggressive religious agenda. Akbar the Great was famously tolerant, inviting scholars of many faiths to his court. Aurangzeb, by contrast, imposed stricter Islamic laws, alienating parts of his empire and fueling resistance. The grandeur of the Mughal courts, silk carpets, jeweled swords, marble palaces, was as much a political weapon as their armies. Every guest, every ambassador who walked into those glittering halls was meant to think, if they can afford this, I don't want to fight them. By the 18th century, the Mughal Empire was weakening. Internal divisions, costly wars, and the rise of European colonial powers chipped away at their dominance. But their legacy, the architecture, the art, the sheer theatricality of their politics still lingers. You can stand in the shadow of the Taj Mahal today, or walk through the halls of the Red Fort, and almost hear the echo of court musicians, the shuffle of silk slippers, and the faint, dangerous clink of a dagger hidden in someone's sleeve. The Mughals built palaces to project power, but they also built prisons to contain their own, and sometimes those prisons had better views than most kingdoms. If you were going to invent a royal origin story, you could do worse than starting with the King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. The Solomonic dynasty of Ethiopia didn't just flirt with this biblical heritage, they married it, had a kid, and built an empire on the family scrapbook. Their official claim, preserved in the medieval text Kebra Nagast, was that the Queen of Sheba, known locally as Makeda, visited King Solomon in Jerusalem, returned home pregnant, and gave birth to Menelik I, the dynasty's founder. According to the story, Menelik later traveled to meet his father, came back to Ethiopia with a retinue of noble youths, and in a move that would make even the boldest jewel thieves blush, brought the Ark of the Covenant with him. Yes, that Ark, the one allegedly containing the Ten Commandments. This wasn't just a charming fireside myth, it was a political masterstroke. A royal family claiming descent from Solomon didn't need to prove their legitimacy through endless wars or elaborate genealogical guesswork. God had already done the paperwork. By tying themselves to the great unifying stories of Judaism and Christianity, the Solomonic monarchs wielded a kind of sacred authority that made rebellion not just treason, but borderline heresy. The Ark myth was the jewel in this crown of divine legitimacy. The claim that it was housed in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum gave Ethiopia something no other kingdom could match, a relic so powerful it didn't just sanctify their rule, it practically set it on fire with divine endorsement. The Ark was said to be guarded by a single monk, chosen for life, who was forbidden to leave the chapel. It was a mix of intense faith, unbreakable tradition, and possibly the most stressful job description in history. The object itself was never shown to outsiders, adding a haze of mystery or convenient ambiguity depending on your level of skepticism. Coronation rituals in the Solomonic dynasty were equally steeped in sacred theatre. The new ruler was crowned in Aksum, often with the presence of high-ranking clergy who underscored the divine origins of the throne. Sacred oil, biblical chants, and public readings from the Kebra Nagast reinforced the idea that this was no ordinary political figure. This was God's chosen descendant, sitting at the pinnacle of a bloodline stretching back to Solomon himself. but a ruler this elevated wasn't necessarily accessible. Royal life in the Highlands often meant a level of isolation that could be both strategic and suffocating. The emperor was not just the head of state, he was a semi-mythical presence, distanced from the daily lives of his people. Access to the monarch was strictly limited, not only for security reasons, but also to maintain an aura of almost supernatural remoteness. Even the capital was prone to relocation. The court was mobile, sometimes shifting locations in response to threats, political convenience, or the emperor's whims. While the dynasty's religious and cultural traditions projected a stable, divinely ordained monarchy, the reality beneath the ceremonial surface could be turbulent. Challenges to the throne still happened, and when they did, the rebels weren't just fighting an emperor, they were attempting to topple a centuries-old divine order. This gave political conflict in Ethiopia a particularly high-stakes flavor. A usurper wasn't merely seizing power. They were rewriting a sacred story that had been told for generations. The Kebra Nagast itself became more than literature. It was a political handbook, theological text, and national epic rolled into one. Its vivid storytelling didn't just recount the past, it actively shaped Ethiopia's identity by portraying Ethiopia as the second Israel. Blessed with the Ark and chosen by God, it created a narrative of spiritual centrality that was hard for other nations to compete with. For the Solomonic dynasty, this narrative was both armor and weapon. It provided insulation against outside influence, reinforcing Ethiopia's self-perception as a unique, God-protected kingdom in a region often subject to shifting foreign powers. At the same time, it offered a rallying point for unity in times of threat, an invaluable advantage for a realm with vast, mountainous terrain and diverse ethnic groups. But divine lineage and legendary relics could not entirely shield the dynasty from the tides of history. Internal rivalries, foreign invasions, and political shifts all left their mark, and by the 20th century, the Solomonic dynasty was navigating a world where ancient myths had to coexist with modern geopolitics. The last emperor, Haile Selassie I, still invoked the Solomonic heritage, standing as a living link to a story that began with Sheba and Solomon. To many Ethiopians, and even to the Rastafarian movement in the Caribbean, he was not just a ruler, but the embodiment of a divine promise. In the end, the Solomonic dynasty's greatest achievement might not have been its military campaigns or its architectural projects, but the endurance of its myth. For centuries, its rulers stood on a foundation built not of stone but of story, and in Ethiopia that proved stronger than most fortresses. They understood a timeless truth of monarchy. Swords rust, palaces crumble, but a good origin story lasts forever. If there were awards for turning personal drama into national policy, the British monarchy, especially the Tudors, would have swept the category every year. Henry VIII, for instance, didn't just have a midlife crisis, he restructured the entire country's religion to accommodate it. Marriage, to him, was less a sacred vow and more a royal subscription plan. Cancel any time, consequences extra. 6 wives in under 4 decades, 2 executed, 1 annulled, 1 who died after childbirth, and 2 who outlived him. History remembers the rhyme, but the reality was far bloodier than any nursery chant. The problem was, every personal decision Henry made came with a side order of constitutional chaos. Couldn't get a male heir with Catherine of Aragon? Easy, declare the marriage void, marry Anne Boleyn, and make the Pope your personal enemy. When that soured, it wasn't just a divorce, it was a full-on state event, complete with public trials, propaganda campaigns, and the occasional beheading to keep everyone on message. Henry's court wasn't merely a place for governance, it was a live-action soap opera with extremely high stakes, and nobody was guaranteed to make it past the season finale. Then came Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter, who inherited both the throne and her father's taste for pageantry, but tempered it with an iron will and better PR. Elizabeth mastered the art of being seen without being entirely known. She used masks, elaborate processions, and carefully staged appearances to project the image of the untouchable Virgin Queen. Courtiers were expected to play their parts in this royal theatre, sometimes literally, Her court staged allegorical plays in which flattering the queen was as important as remembering your lines. The goal wasn't just entertainment, it was political choreography. Every glance, every gown, every poetic flourish was designed to remind everyone that Elizabeth was the sun around which the realm revolved. Of course, court life under the Tudors wasn't all velvet and lute music. It could turn on you faster than you could curtsy. An offhand remark or political miscalculation might earn you a visit to the Tower of London, where the view was mostly stone walls and your own regrets. Even those in favour had to keep up appearances. Elizabeth was famously touchy about her image, and courtiers knew better than to suggest she was aging, tired, or anything less than radiant. Mirrors in her private chambers were carefully managed to flatter, and portraits were subtly improved before presentation. By the time we get to the Georgian kings, eccentricity wasn't just a quirk, it was practically a job description. George III, for example, is often remembered for his bouts of mental illness, but even when lucid, his court life could be odd. He was intensely frugal for a king, famously reusing candle ends and avoiding extravagant feasts. He also had an unusual fixation with agriculture, earning him the nickname Farmer George, and was known to lecture courtiers about crop rotation while wearing full regalia. It was as if the royal court had been temporarily replaced by a garden club meeting, only with more gold leaf. George's eccentricities extended to etiquette as well. Guests might be summoned at inconvenient hours for unexpectedly formal occasions, or find themselves required to engage in elaborate, outdated rituals simply because the king preferred them. The Georgian-era court retained a flair for pageantry, but it often felt more like an eccentric family gathering than the tightly choreographed political theatre of the Tudors. One courtier reportedly described it as a mixture of grand opera and village fair, with an agricultural advisory board on the side. Even in later centuries, the British royal taste for public spectacle remained intact. Coronations, jubilees, and royal weddings weren't just personal milestones. They were national theatre, blending tradition with whatever eccentricities the monarch happened to favour. From Elizabeth I's carefully staged progresses to George III's awkward agricultural chats, the monarchy understood that visibility was power. The trick was in controlling the narrative, making sure the public saw the grandeur, the benevolence, and the majesty, while the messy reality remained carefully behind the curtain. In many ways, the Tudors and their successors perfected the art of ruling through personality. Henry VIII bent the church to his will. Elizabeth I wrapped political authority in glittering performance, and the Georgians proved that even quirks could be spun into charm. The British monarchy survived revolutions, religious upheaval, and the slow creep of parliamentary power, partly because it learned that public image was as critical as policy. But there was always a risk in making the monarch the centerpiece of the show. When the star stumbled, the whole performance wobbled. Henry's desperate quest for a son plunged the realm into decades of religious conflict. Elizabeth's refusal to name a successor created tension that outlived her. George III's mental decline became a public matter, leading to a regency that was itself riddled with drama. The crown might have been steady, but the heads beneath it were decidedly unpredictable. Still, for all their faults, these monarchs knew how to keep an audience. Whether it was a royal wedding turned international headline, or a masque designed to dazzle a skeptical court, they understood that ruling wasn't just about passing laws, it was about being seen, admired, and talked about. In that sense, the Tudors and their eccentric successors were the ultimate influencers, centuries before the term existed. They curated their images, staged their appearances, and turned personal obsessions into national events. After all, why simply govern when you can also be the lead actor in a decades-long historical drama? If the Victorian era had a Tinder profile, it would read, "Loves long walks through industrial smog, late-night seances, and inventing gadgets that are equal parts genius and hazard." Between 1837 and 1901, Britain wasn't just building an empire, it was building things, lots of things. and they all seem to have extra gears, unnecessary brass fittings, and a tendency to either leak, explode, or confuse the family cat. You have to understand the mindset. The Victorian period was the great marriage of industrial capability and domestic boredom. The factories were churning, the middle class was swelling, and more people than ever had the money and leisure time to tinker, and tinker they did. The result was a culture where inventors, engineers, and eccentric hobbyists all operated on the same principle. If it's inconvenient, invent something to make it weirdly more complicated. This wasn't just about progress. It was about showing off progress. A kettle that boiled faster was practical. A kettle that played God Save the Queen when the steam whistled was Victorian. They adored the combination of spectacle and function, even when the function was questionable. In an age before smartphones and television, mechanical novelty was entertainment. Dinner parties could quickly devolve into show and tell for your latest acquisition, a clock that dispensed sherry every hour, or a self-rocking cradle for your baby that looked suspiciously like it might eject them across the room. The 19th century saw patent offices flooded with applications. In Britain alone, the number of annual patents increased more than tenfold between 1850 and 1900. The Great Exhibition of 1851, the Crystal Palace's grand display of industrial achievement, was practically an international bragfest of impractical genius. You could walk past agricultural machines the size of cottages, self-playing pianos, and labor-saving devices that probably required more effort to set up than just doing the job yourself. The driving force wasn't just technological enthusiasm. The Victorians were also obsessed with order and domestic efficiency, even if their definition of efficiency required 6 servants and a steam engine. This was an era that believed comfort and civilization could be engineered. If your parlor could have a mechanized ventilation system, why not your bathtub? If you could bring the latest innovation into the drawing room to impress guests, even better. After all, a fixed bath in an upstairs bathroom was hidden away, but a rolling bath, now that you could parade through the hall. They also had a particular fondness for adding danger to otherwise mundane activities. It's not enough to make a toaster. It should also have exposed electrical coils that hum ominously. It's not enough to make a coffee pot. It should be capable of launching boiling liquid across the table if you look at it wrong. This was the same world that produced penny-farthing bicycles, where the rider was seated precariously 6 feet in the air with nothing but Victorian optimism to protect them from gravity. And the inventors themselves? Half brilliant engineers, half theatrical showmen, figures like Sir Hiram Maxim, who gave us both the first portable machine gun and a steam-powered flying machine that nearly killed its test passengers, were part of the same cultural atmosphere that thought a bathtub on wheels was worth a try. In their eyes, an invention wasn't truly valuable unless it made people talk, ideally in both admiration and mild horror. This love for invention also thrived because of the Victorian patent culture. Patents were relatively affordable, and there was social prestige in being an inventor, even if your idea was never manufactured. This led to a strange economy of prototypes and one-off curiosities, devices that were made for exhibitions, sold to a handful of wealthy eccentrics, and then quietly forgotten when they proved impractical. The rolling bathtub fits neatly into this category, a contraption that perfectly captured the Victorian balance between creativity, absurdity, and a slight disregard for human safety. We should also remember that the Victorian era was deeply competitive. Neighbors tried to outdo each other in garden design, home decoration, and yes, household technology. Inventions became a kind of social weapon. Having a mechanical birdcage that sang on its own was the 19th century equivalent of showing off your home theater system. A rolling bathtub? That was a statement. It told visitors, I am modern, I am innovative, and I am willing to risk a hallway collision for the sake of progress. The result was an atmosphere where ideas that would make a modern safety inspector faint could be celebrated as clever and even necessary. The Victorians never saw complexity as a drawback. They saw it as a mark of sophistication. More gears, more pipes, more knobs. This was not over-engineering. This was proper engineering. And if your invention happened to be mobile and could possibly destroy a carpet, Well, you just invented the conversation piece of the season. In short, the Victorians lived in a time when invention was not just encouraged, but practically a form of sport. Whether it was the telegraph, the sewing machine, or a bathtub on wheels, it all came from the same mindset, a belief that the future could and should be built in your backyard workshop, preferably with brass fittings and mild danger to life and limb. Or to put it another way, the Victorians never met a problem they couldn't solve with brass, steam, and mild danger. Picture a Victorian evening in winter, the frost bites at the windows, the coal fire is sputtering, and somewhere in the kitchen, a servant is regretting every life choice that led to lugging another bucket of hot water up the stairs. Because in the mid-1800s, taking a bath was less an act of hygiene and more a logistical operation, one that required time, manpower, and the physical endurance of a prize fighter. Before the rolling bathtub rolled into the picture, most people relied on what can generously be described as stationary bathing solutions. For the working classes and many in the middle class, that meant a tin or copper tub, often oval-shaped, sitting in front of the fireplace. You'd fill it by carrying water in jugs or buckets from the kitchen or a pump outside, which in winter felt like carrying liquid ice until you boiled it over the range. One bath could require 30 to 40 gallons, which meant trip after trip after trip. By the time you had enough, the first bucket had already cooled down to a temperature that could double as a wake-up call for penguins. Indoor plumbing was making its debut during the Victorian era, but it was far from universal. In fact, in the 1840s, even in major cities like London, most homes didn't have piped water, and if they did, it wasn't necessarily clean. A hot bath in such households was a luxury event, rare enough that family members might take turns in the same water, in strict order of seniority. By strict order I mean the father went first, then the mother, then the children, and finally the baby, who got what was essentially lukewarm tea made of their siblings' filth. For those without the means or the patience to heat all that water, there were public bathhouses, a relic of both Roman inspiration and urban necessity. In the growing industrial cities, municipal bathhouses were built to allow the working poor to wash themselves for a small fee. Some were grand, with steam rooms and plunge pools. Others were essentially large wooden tubs in a drafty shed. Either way, public bathing came with the perk of convenience, but also the risk of sharing more than just conversation with your fellow bathers. Let's just say Victorian medicine wasn't quite ready to explain all the things you could catch in a warm communal pool. For many rural families, the idea of regular bathing was more theoretical than practical. Instead, there was the practice of sponge baths, a bowl of water, a cloth, and the hope that no one smelled too closely. The reasoning was simple. Heating water was exhausting, hauling water was exhausting, and frankly, washing your whole body when you could just scrub the visible parts seemed unnecessary. If you were a farmer or laborer, the expectation was that you'd sweat out the dirt and replace it with fresh dirt the next day. The upper classes, of course, had more elaborate arrangements. Wealthy Victorians could afford dedicated bathing rooms, often outfitted with marble basins or enormous fixed tubs. But even in these grand houses, plumbing might not reach the second or third floor, so water still had to be carried in and out by servants. And these bathtubs, they were not the smooth porcelain affairs we picture today. Many were lined with sheets of zinc or copper, good for holding water, less good for retaining heat, and even less good for avoiding the occasional sharp edge. Bath frequency in the era was another fascinating point. While Victorian moralists loved to preach the virtues of cleanliness, the practical reality was that most people bathed once a week, and often less in winter. This is where our funny but true comparison comes in. In the 1800s, bath time was like Christmas, rare, labor-intensive, and usually in December. Daily bathing was considered unnecessary, and even potentially unhealthy by some doctors who feared it might weaken the constitution or lead to chills. Soap, too, was an evolving product. In the early 19th century, it was often homemade, rough, and better suited for laundry than skin. By the later Victorian period, commercial scented soaps began to appear, advertised as both a health measure and a mark of refinement. The advertisements naturally implied that if you didn't use their soap, you were basically a walking cautionary tale. And we can't forget the logistics of modesty. In a time when clothing covered everything from neck to ankle, disrobing for a bath could be a socially loaded event, even in your own household. Portable screens, heavy curtains, and strategic layers were used to guard dignity. Servants tasked with assisting their employers during bath time had to master the art of pretending to be deeply interested in the wallpaper while pouring water. The whole bathing process, from heating water to hauling it, from washing to draining the tub, could easily take an entire evening. And that was assuming you had no accidents along the way, like dropping a bucket, scalding your foot, or discovering halfway through that you'd run out of hot water. Given the sheer amount of work involved, it's not hard to see why an invention that promised to make the bath itself mobile would seem like a gift from the gods, or at least from some mechanically inclined Victorian eccentric. In short, before the rolling bathtub came along, bathing was a combination of military planning, heavy labor, and strategic water conservation. It's no wonder that when someone suggested bringing the bath to you instead of dragging yourself and all your buckets to it, the Victorians were willing to listen, even if the result occasionally rolled into the nearest wall. Like many great leaps forward in history, the printing press, penicillin, sliced bread, the rolling bathtub began with a simple question: what if the problem isn't that bathing is too much work, but that it's happening in the wrong place? The 19th century was a time when every inconvenience was seen as an engineering challenge. If something required walking, bending, or lifting, there was a Victorian somewhere sketching a contraption to eliminate it. Enter the mobile bath, a wheeled, water-filled vessel designed to meet you halfway, literally. Instead of you trudging to the bathroom came to you. While records of exactly who invented the first rolling bathtub are patchy, we do have a few breadcrumbs in the archives. Several patents for movable bathing apparatus appeared between the 1850s and the 1890s. One such patent, filed in 1883 by an Englishman named Henry Jenkins of Manchester, described a portable bath of metal construction mounted on small wheels, with provision for drainage via a detachable hose. It wasn't a household name invention. You weren't going to see it in every home, but it was an idea that made enough sense for multiple inventors to have a go at it. There were also earlier continental European versions. French catalogues from the 1870s advertised baignoire portatives, portable tubs on casters, aimed at the wealthy invalid market, individuals who were bedridden or convalescing. These tubs were intended to be wheeled to the bedside, filled on the spot, and emptied without moving the patient. In other words, it was a medical solution before it was a household novelty. But the Victorian era being what it was, the idea didn't stay purely medical for long. Once the wealthy realized they could take a bath anywhere, in front of the fire in the conservatory, or for the scandalously bold in the garden, the rolling bathtub crossed over from practical aid to luxurious oddity. It became a conversation starter, a statement of status, and in some cases a party trick. The core concept was charmingly straightforward: mount a bathtub on wheels, make it easy to roll across floors, and design it so it could be filled and drained without back-breaking effort. Some models had brass fittings and polished wooden frames to match fine Victorian interiors. Others were purely utilitarian, with galvanized steel tubs on basic iron casters. A few high-end models even had built-in heating compartments underneath, so the bather could enjoy sustained warmth. Although these came with the mild risk of setting yourself on fire, which Victorians seemed to accept as part of the thrill. It's worth noting that the rolling bathtub solved more than just laziness. In houses without upstairs plumbing, moving water from a ground floor source to a bedroom was still a huge chore. A mobile bath meant you could have the tub wheeled to a location closer to where the water was heated, usually the kitchen, and enjoy the fire's warmth while you soaked. For those with servants, this meant less strain in carrying buckets up and down stairs. For those without servants, it meant slightly less chance of pulling a muscle before you'd even stepped into the bath. But make no mistake, even if the rolling bathtub was practical, its allure was also performative. Imagine a guest arriving for tea, only to find you reclining in a brass and oak tub parked in the middle of your drawing room, steam rising as you sip from a porcelain cup. In a culture obsessed with novelty, this was peak Victorian theatre, and it made the owner look both modern and delightfully eccentric. Of course, no innovation escaped the Victorian press. The mobile bath was occasionally featured in illustrated newspapers, sandwiched between articles on new sewing machines and the latest in agricultural tools. One 1885 column in the Illustrated London News described it as a contrivance most convenient for the infirm, but equally suited to the fashionable lady who desires to preserve her warmth whilst partaking in domestic amusements. Translation: perfect for anyone who wanted to bathe without giving up gossip hour. Even with its modest success, the rolling bathtub never became a mainstream necessity. It was in many ways a transitional object, bridging the gap between the era of labor-intensive, room-specific bathing and the age of fixed, plumbed bathrooms. The fact that it was portable made it adaptable to the varied, often awkward layouts of Victorian homes. The fact that it was wheeled made it a perfect candidate for both medical care and social spectacle. The funny thing is, the core idea of bringing the bath to the bather was never about speed. This wasn't an invention to shave minutes off your routine. It was an invention to change where you could luxuriate. It was about the luxury of choice. Did you want to bathe in the study while reading, in the music room while your daughter played piano, or perhaps in the sunlit parlor, daring the neighbors to catch a glimpse through the curtains? With the rolling bathtub, all of these were possible, if you had the nerve. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it represented a certain Victorian triumph, bathing without standing up. After centuries of hauling yourself to a designated space, climbing in and out of awkward vessels, and possibly freezing along the way, here was the chance to remain gloriously stationary while the trappings of cleanliness came to you. Truly, mankind had peaked. The rolling bathtub, for all its novelty, was not a simple device. This wasn't just a regular tub with wheels slapped on. It was a piece of Victorian engineering, which meant it was overbuilt, over-decorated, and occasionally over-dangerous. Let's break down its design, mechanics, and the many ways it could betray you in the pursuit of cleanliness. The foundation of any mobile bath was its wheels, usually small metal or wooden casters, often borrowed from furniture making. Some designs featured fixed wheels for straight-line movement, while others went for the more ambitious swivel casters, allowing the tub to be steered. Steering, of course, was a generous term. More often than not, the bath had a mind of its own, especially once you factored in the momentum of 30 to 40 gallons of water. Brakes existed in some models, usually in the form of a lever or wedge you jammed under the wheel. The quality of these brakes ranged from reasonably sturdy to a polite suggestion to physics. If you bathed on a polished wooden floor without securing the tub, you risked slowly migrating across the room like a ship drifting at sea. The tub itself could be made of copper, galvanized steel, or tin, metals chosen for durability, though they also had a knack for conducting heat and sometimes burning unwary bathers. The basin was mounted within a decorative frame which might be made from oak, mahogany, or even wrought iron. The frame wasn't just for looks. It kept the wheels aligned and provided places to attach drainage systems or heating compartments. In the higher-end versions, the interior might be lined with enamel to make cleaning easier and to protect delicate skin from the sometimes rough edges of metalwork. This lining, however, could chip, turning your luxury soak into a game of find the sharp bit before it finds you. Some rolling bathtubs were heated the old-fashioned way. You poured in hot water from jugs and hoped it stayed warm long enough for a decent soak. Others, however, featured an integrated heating system. These were typically small compartments under the tub where you could burn coal, wood, or even spirit fuel to keep the water at a comfortable temperature. In theory, this was a stroke of genius. In practice, it was a delicate balancing act between pleasant warmth and boiling cauldron of death. The heat was hard to regulate, and there was always the small but non-negligible risk of setting your bathrobe, your floor, or yourself on fire. Victorians, to their credit, seemed remarkably comfortable with this level of hazard. Emptying a rolling bath was another adventure. Some models had a simple plug at the bottom, allowing the water to gush out onto the floor, fine if you were in a tiled bathing room, less fine if you were in the parlor. More sophisticated designs included a hose attachment, which you could lead to a drain or even out the window if you didn't mind watering the shrubs with a hint of soap. But even this system wasn't foolproof. Hoses could detach unexpectedly, spraying the room with warm water, or clog with hair and soap scum, creating an unpleasant surprise during your next bath. And the hazards? 1. Hot water spills. Water in motion has its own ideas about where it wants to go, and a mobile tub was essentially a slosh machine on wheels. A sudden push, a careless turn, or an overly enthusiastic servant could send half the bathwater cascading over the edge. If it was freshly heated, congratulations, you'd just invented the indoor hot spring, minus the relaxing part. 2. Runaway tubs. Without proper brakes, a rolling bathtub could and did go rogue. Slight inclines were enough to start a slow, inevitable roll toward whatever lay downhill. In houses with grand staircases, this could turn the bath into a Victorian version of a log flume ride. For the unlucky, this ended with the bather halfway into the pantry, still clutching the soap. Collisions. Houses were not designed for large water-filled objects to navigate freely. The rolling bathtub could easily crash into furniture, chip door frames, or knock over anything in its path. One imagines a startled guest holding a teacup as a steaming copper vessel barrels past them on the way to the dining room. 3. Structural strain. 30 gallons of water weighs around 250 pounds, not including the tub or the bather. That's a lot of weight on a set of small casters, and even more strain on creaky Victorian floorboards. In older houses, one ill-advised roll toward a weak spot could turn bath time into basement time. 4. Surprise drain events. If the plug came loose mid-bath, the tub could drain unexpectedly, leaving you sitting in an empty basin wondering what just happened. Worse still, the water could end up pooling under the wheels, creating a perfect surface for your mobile bath to start ice skating. For all its hazards, those who used rolling bathtubs swore by the convenience, or at least by the novelty. Being able to enjoy a hot soak anywhere in the house was a luxury that outweighed the occasional risk of rolling into a wall. The sound of water sloshing in rhythm with the creak of wheels became, for a brief period, a quirky symbol of modern comfort. In the end, the rolling bathtub worked exactly as promised. It brought the bath to you. Whether it also brought burns, bruises, or unplanned visits to other rooms was simply part of the deal. The good news, you were warm. The bad news, you were also in the pantry. When you picture the Victorian rolling bathtub, you might imagine it as some egalitarian marvel, a democratized bathing solution trundling across Britain's parlors. But reality was far less inclusive. These contraptions didn't just roll, they practically screamed wealth, privilege, and the type of household where someone else was paid to fetch your slippers. Let's be honest, if you had to push your own rolling bathtub around, it lost a great deal of its charm. A 200-pound copper or tin tub filled with hot water wasn't something you casually wheeled from bedroom to drawing room. Wealthy households, however, had both the space to store such a contraption and the manpower to operate it. Servants were the unsung heroes or victims, depending on your perspective, of the rolling bath era, tasked with filling it, heating the water, wheeling it to the master or mistress, then draining and returning it when finished. In these grand homes, the rolling bathtub was an indulgence that meant you could take your bath wherever you pleased, in front of a roaring fire, near a window with a view of your gardens, or in your private sitting room while reading the morning paper. The concept wasn't about practicality, it was about decadence. Another surprising demographic for the rolling bath was the convalescent and mobility impaired. In an era before walk-in showers and hospital-grade bathing chairs, the rolling tub was seen as an innovation for patients recovering from illness, the elderly, and those with disabilities. The logic was simple. Rather than making a frail person trek to the bathroom or the one designated washroom in the house, the bath came to them. In hospitals and private sick rooms, attendants would wheel in a small, specially designed tub that could fit through doorways and be positioned close to the bed. While this was no doubt more comfortable for the patient, it also carried its own dangers. Moving hot water through narrow hallways meant that more than one nurse ended up with scalded shins or damp skirts. It was the Victorian version of healthcare's occupational hazard. Some high-end boarding houses and luxury hotels also adopted rolling bathtubs as a way to provide private bathing without dedicating multiple rooms to fixed plumbing. Guests could request a bath, and within an hour or so a steaming, mobile oasis would be wheeled to their door. It was an excellent way to impress clientele, though not always a discreet one. The sight of a maid wrestling a sloshing copper tub down a hallway was less five-star spa and more Victorian slapstick. Even certain gentlemen's clubs in London, those bastions of cigars, newspapers and political gossip, reportedly had rolling baths on standby. For members who wanted to freshen up between a fencing match and a brandy, this was an ideal solution. The tubs, of course, were stationed far from public areas, since nothing would have shattered the mystique of Victorian masculinity faster than catching Lord So-and-so in his birthday suit while rolling past the billiards table. It's worth noting that while rolling tubs were overwhelmingly for the upper crust, there were rare occasions when servants got to use them, typically when their employers were away or the household was in an unusually generous mood. Bathing was still considered a luxury for much of the working class, and having the master's portable bath rolled into the servants' quarters must have felt like winning the hygiene lottery. More than anything, owning a rolling bathtub signaled that you were not merely wealthy but creatively wealthy, the sort of person who didn't just want hot water but wanted hot water to come to you. It was the Victorian equivalent of having a chauffeur for your swimming pool. But there was a catch to all this privilege. Somebody had to stop the thing from moving once it reached you. Without brakes, or with very bad brakes, rolling bathtubs could easily glide past their intended destination. That's why most households employing them had a human handbrake, usually a footman or butler tasked with steadying the tub so it didn't slam into a desk, piano or wall. Bathing, therefore, became not just a personal act of cleanliness but a minor group performance complete with stagehands. In the end, the rolling bathtub's clientele tells you everything about Victorian society. Technology was embraced only when it could be wrapped in luxury, showcased as a novelty, and operated by someone else. The working class could admire them from afar, the sick could cling to them for comfort, and the wealthy could lounge in them with a glass of sherry, secure in the knowledge that the bath, like everything else in their lives, would always come to them. In the hierarchy of Victorian oddities, the rolling bathtub sat somewhere between mechanical trousers and portable moustache warmers. It was novel, it was impractical, and it was just absurd enough to make polite society unsure whether to laugh, gasp, or quietly pretend it wasn't happening. When the first rolling baths appeared in advertisements, the tone was earnest. Here was an innovation that promised cleanliness without the exertion of carrying heavy jugs of hot water across icy corridors. But the public's first encounters with these contraptions often came not in private bathing rooms, but in hallways, parlors, and occasionally dining rooms, because bathtubs on wheels have a habit of making unplanned appearances. For the practical-minded Victorian, the rolling bath was a marvel of convenience, a step forward for hygiene, and a way to bring bathing to people who otherwise might avoid it altogether. For everyone else, it was simply ridiculous. Editorial cartoons poked fun at the idea of a gentleman taking a turn down the hallway in a state of sudsy undress, while satirical magazines like Punch depicted baths crashing through drawing rooms during tea service. House guests, meanwhile, never quite knew how to react. Should one marvel at the engineering, or should one quietly avert one's eyes and carry on discussing the weather while a half-naked uncle trundled past? Victorian society was famously prim about matters of propriety, which made the rolling bath a sort of cultural hand grenade. Even though baths were intended to be used in private, the presence of wheels introduced the risk of mobility mishaps. One poorly locked brake, one over-enthusiastic servant, and suddenly the bather could find themselves in motion. Etiquette guides of the era never explicitly covered what to do if you encounter a rolling bath in the hallway, but improvised rules quickly emerged. Avoid eye contact at all costs. Pretend the bather is simply a piece of furniture being moved. Do not comment on the temperature of the water, even if they appear to be steaming. And above all, never ever open the front door without first checking for inbound rolling tubs. Bathing in the Victorian age was already a chore, often reserved for weekly or even monthly events. Adding wheels turned it into a potential spectator sport. In houses with narrow hallways and numerous servants bustling about, the risk of inconvenient encounters was high. Imagine you're halfway through your bath when the door opens, not because someone barged in, but because your bathtub has rolled directly into the drawing room during afternoon tea. The reactions would range from horrified gasps to suppressed giggles, depending on whether you were the head of the household or the local vicar. And then there were multi-story houses. In theory, the rolling bath could be wheeled to different floors. In practice, this meant hauling the thing up or downstairs, which was awkward at best and catastrophic at worst. If a wheel slipped, you didn't just risk a bump, you risked making history as the first person to surf a bathtub down the main staircase. Upper-class Victorians were trained to maintain composure in all circumstances, but the rolling bath tested even the most seasoned hostess. If a visiting duchess was confronted with a sudsy relative zooming by, she might maintain a fixed smile and say, "How clever," while discreetly repositioning herself behind a potted fern. Servants, meanwhile, often bore the brunt of the chaos. They were the ones tasked with maneuvering these water-laden wagons through cramped passages without spilling, scraping wallpaper, or causing bodily harm. A skilled footman could guide a full bath through a narrow archway with the precision of a warship captain navigating a reef. A less skilled one might accidentally introduce the bather to the wine cellar. What if an accident did happen? The polite response depended heavily on the social setting. In family situations, the incident might be met with teasing and a towel. In mixed company, the safest move was to feign ignorance, as though nothing unusual had occurred. In formal gatherings, a rolling bathtub was to be treated like a fainting guest. Help them to a safe spot, offer smelling salts if needed, though preferably not in the bathwater, and resume conversation as though the incident was entirely ordinary. Naturally, not everyone managed this level of decorum. Anecdotes survive of rolling baths interrupting dinners, startling cats, and in one spectacular mishap sending a freshly bathed gentleman through a pair of French doors into the garden. He claimed it was invigorating, though one suspects he was trying to save face. As with many eccentric Victorian inventions, repeated exposure gradually reduced the shock value. Guests became adept at ignoring the gentle squeak of wheels on floorboards. Servants perfected their timing to avoid hallway traffic jams, and households with rolling baths developed their own unspoken codes. You never bathed during visiting hours, and you always checked that the brake was engaged before closing your eyes. Still, the rolling bath never fully shed its reputation as an object of mild absurdity. It remained a symbol of both ingenuity and impracticality, a reminder that even in an age obsessed with progress, etiquette and engineering didn't always roll smoothly together. By the time the rolling bathtub had found its way into the parlors and hallways of the upper crust, it had also rolled quite comfortably into the collective Victorian imagination. This wasn't just a household oddity anymore. It was an object ripe for satire, gentle mockery, and on rare occasions, admiration. In a world where even the fainting couch could be considered a topic of polite dinner conversation, the idea of a bathtub on wheels was simply too delicious for journalists, illustrators, and writers to ignore. Victorian newspapers, ever hungry for something to make readers raise an eyebrow over their morning tea, seized upon the rolling tub as a perfect combination of novelty and absurdity. Advertisements often promised that it would bring ease, mobility, and comfort to the domestic bath, which, to the average middle-class reader, sounded like code for your rich friends now get to bathe in the hallway. Illustrated ads showed elegantly dressed ladies perched on the edge of gleaming copper tubs being gently rolled by liveried footmen. In reality, the scene was more awkward than luxurious. But marketing in the Victorian era wasn't exactly in the business of accurate depictions. Satirical cartoonists found even greater inspiration. The period's humor magazines, Punch in particular, ran sketches of hapless bathers careening down grand staircases or being wheeled directly into family gatherings. One memorable cartoon featured a stern matron scolding a dripping wet gentleman who had apparently been rolled straight into the ballroom mid-dance. The caption read, "The hazards of punctual bathing." The rolling tub became a visual shorthand for over-engineered luxury, the kind of indulgence that only people who'd never hauled their own water could appreciate. Literary references also trickled in. In serialized stories, authors occasionally inserted the rolling bath as a small but pointed detail, a signal to readers that a character belonged to that rarefied class who could afford to turn bathing into a spectator sport. It appears fleetingly in humorous domestic sketches, often as a source of disruption. A well-timed rolling tub could derail a romantic proposal or interrupt a tense family meeting, creating precisely the kind of social chaos Victorian audiences enjoyed from the safety of their reading chairs. Household manuals, which ranged from the painfully earnest to the unintentionally hilarious, sometimes gave the rolling tub a nod. In the section on modern bathing conveniences, one guide offered firm advice. The perambulating bath is best employed in private chambers or secluded corridors, lest the bather be subject to sudden and indelicate exposure. Which is Victorian for, do not let your bath escape into public view. Manuals also recommended a strong, sober-minded servant to operate the wheels, a polite way of saying that alcohol and bathtub mobility did not mix. The rolling tub's pop culture presence also had an aspirational edge. For the truly wealthy, having their oddities immortalized in print was a subtle form of social bragging. If your home improvement made Punch even as a punchline, it meant you were living in a world so cushioned by privilege that even your follies were newsworthy. A few society pages even hinted that owning a rolling tub was a sign of modern domestic progress, though one suspects this was written by someone trying to sell a warehouse full of them. Beyond the humor, the rolling tub's fame also hinted at broader Victorian anxieties. The late 19th century was a period of rapid technological change, and the average household was caught between the lure of convenience and the fear of looking ridiculous. The mobile bathtub was a perfect metaphor for that tension, undeniably clever, questionably necessary, and easy to laugh at from a safe distance. It made Victorians ask themselves, was progress really about making life easier, or was it about inventing increasingly eccentric ways to show you didn't have to work as hard as everyone else? In time, the rolling bathtub faded from the spotlight, replaced in both homes and humor columns by newer, stranger contraptions. But its cultural moment left behind a certain archetype, the luxury device so impractical it practically begged to be mocked. From the absurdities of motorized tea trays to the overcomplication of mechanical hat tippers, the rolling tub was the pioneer of a very particular kind of Victorian gadgetry, one that straddled the fine line between innovation and parody. The funny thing is, for all the jokes it worked, people did use it, people did talk about it, and people, the very same ones who scoffed in print, probably secretly tried one when they got the chance, because at the end of the day, who wouldn't want to know what it feels like to be rolled gently down the hall toward a roaring fire, even if it meant risking an unplanned appearance in the society pages? As Punch might have put it, if your bathtub makes the front page, congratulations, you've peaked in Victorian society. The rolling bathtub had its moment, that brief, glorious intersection of Victorian ingenuity, eccentricity, and sheer impracticality, before history wheeled it right out of fashion. For a few decades it seemed like the perfect solution for those who wanted to enjoy a bath without trudging to a draughty bathroom, or without actually having one. But by the late 19th and early 20th century, these contraptions were vanishing from households as quickly as damp towels after laundry day. And the reasons, as we'll see, ranged from technology and safety to the simple fact that it's hard to look dignified when your hygiene routine resembles a scene from slapstick theatre. The biggest nail in the rolling bathtub's coffin was not a social scandal or a royal decree, it was the pipe. By the mid to late Victorian era, cities were rapidly installing fixed water and drainage systems. For the wealthy, This meant that a bathroom could finally be equipped with a permanent tub, proper taps, and a drainage hole that didn't require emptying by hand. The bath on wheels, once a clever way to bring water to the bather, now seemed about as modern as lighting your home with whale oil. Indoor plumbing didn't just make bathing more convenient, it made it faster. Instead of summoning servants to fill and later haul away buckets of water, you could simply turn a tap. With time saved and privacy improved, the idea of rolling a sloshing, awkward contraption through the halls began to feel quaint, if not downright medieval. It turns out, when you put a human being in a large water-filled metal container on wheels, physics has a lot to say about the outcome. Even the most cautious servant could misjudge a turn, sending their employer sliding in a tidal wave toward the nearest doorframe. Floors became slippery danger zones. While there aren't surviving statistics for bathtub accidents per household, newspaper anecdotes suggest incidents weren't rare. One oft-repeated and possibly embellished tale tells of a minor aristocrat whose rolling bath escaped a servant's grip, gathering speed down a sloping hallway before bursting into a dining room where guests were mid-meal. The man was reportedly unharmed, save for his pride, but the pudding course was ruined. Victorian society placed great stock in maintaining an air of control and propriety, and nothing undermined that faster than being seen half submerged and moving at unsafe speeds toward the china cabinet. In earlier Victorian decades, the rolling bath was a practical way to wash in houses not designed with dedicated bathing spaces. But as plumbing infrastructure spread, the bathroom itself became a status symbol. By the 1890s, having a tiled, plumbed room with a fixed tub was not only more convenient, but also more hygienic. Portable tubs could be awkward to clean thoroughly, especially if their inner surfaces had seams or ridges, and though they were portable, they often had to be emptied manually, meaning used bathwater had to be carried away in buckets, a process not exactly beloved by servants. Fixed tubs with built-in drains were cleaner, easier to maintain, and looked more respectable when showing guests around your home. By the late 19th century, the sprawling layouts of earlier Victorian homes were giving way to more compact urban housing. Rolling bathtubs, which needed wide hallways or large rooms to operate smoothly, simply didn't fit well into smaller living spaces. Navigating a large wheeled object in tight quarters became not just inconvenient but impossible. This shift also meant that live-in servants, essential for moving a rolling bath, were less common in middle-class households. Without a team to fill, move, and empty it, the rolling bathtub transformed from a convenience into an exhausting self-service chore. Part of the rolling bathtub's initial charm was its novelty. Guests could be amused by the sight of a tub trundling past a sitting room, and owners could relish in the sense of modernity and indulgence. But novelty ages quickly, and once the rolling bath became associated with a bygone, slightly ridiculous era of hygiene, it lost its social cachet. What had once been a marker of wealth and modernity was increasingly mocked in satirical illustrations, often depicting rotund gentlemen or prim ladies being wheeled about in absurdly oversized tubs. When something becomes the punchline in Punch magazine, its days as a fashionable household item are numbered. By the first decade of the 20th century, rolling bathtubs were largely museum pieces or curiosities stored in attics. Plumbing had reached even modestly affluent homes, fixed tubs had become standard, and the age of mobile bathing was over. Some tubs were repurposed for other uses, holding laundry, storing coal, or serving as oversized planters in the garden, but their original purpose was all but forgotten. Ultimately, the rolling bathtub disappeared because it was both too much work and too much fun for a culture that valued dignity. Turns out, the safest way to take a bath is not to reenact a runaway train, and while the rolling bath might have been a marvel of its day, history's verdict was clear. You can keep your luxury on wheels, just leave the water where it belongs. The Victorian rolling bathtub may have rattled its last wheel over a century ago, but its legacy is still sloshing around in modern life, sometimes literally. While few of us today are in danger of being spotted trundling down a corridor in our bathwater, the spirit of the contraption lives on in everything from sleek spa tubs to high-tech medical bathing devices. It's proof that even the quirkiest inventions can leave behind ripples that last far longer than the splash they made at the time. Modern spa tubs might seem like the distant, sophisticated descendants of the rolling bathtub, but the family resemblance is there if you squint, and perhaps ignore the fact that they're unlikely to careen into the dining room uninvited. Both promised the same essential fantasy: bathing made easy, comfortable, and perhaps a little luxurious. The Victorians may have had to make do with lukewarm water that cooled faster than an unpopular dinner guest, but the concept of a mobile, private bathing experience was forward-thinking. Today, we just swapped the wheels for whirlpool jets and a waterproof Bluetooth speaker. Interestingly, the closest direct descendant to the rolling bathtub isn't in your average suburban bathroom. It's in hospitals, care facilities, and rehab centers. Modern medical bathing devices often resemble deep, self-contained tubs with built-in seats and mechanical lifts. While they don't roam the hallways, their portability and emphasis on accessible bathing for those with limited mobility echo the Victorian concept almost exactly. In a strange twist, the rolling bathtub's odd mix of convenience and containment found its true calling, not in wealthy drawing rooms but in healthcare. If you've ever read a modern magazine feature titled something like 10 Weirdest Inventions You Won't Believe Existed, chances are the rolling bathtub is in there somewhere between the bicycle that churns butter and the umbrella for your dog. It's become one of those charming look what the past thought was a good idea examples, rolled out, pun unavoidable, as a way to marvel at how far or sideways human ingenuity can go. Museums of design and innovation occasionally display them, partly as an engineering curiosity, partly as a reminder that necessity isn't the only mother of invention. Sometimes it's sheer whimsy. The late 19th century was full of inventions that seem baffling now: collapsible top hats, shoe polishing machines, and beds that eject you at a preset time. The rolling bathtub fits neatly into this tradition of because we can engineering, where gadgets weren't always meant to solve urgent problems but to demonstrate cleverness, status, and sometimes sheer eccentricity. This was the age when technology wasn't just functional, it was conversation starting. If you could wheel your bathtub into the parlor to impress guests, why wouldn't you? Other than common sense, dignity, and the risk of flooding your carpet. Part of the rolling bathtub's enduring appeal is that it's the perfect mix of practical and absurd. On paper, it's a neat solution to the problem of heavy, awkward bathing setups. In practice, it's a Victorian slapstick routine waiting to happen. We imagine the awkward hallway encounters, the sound of sloshing water announcing your approach, and the sheer indignity of hitting a wall mid-soap. That combination of good idea and terrible execution has made it an irresistible anecdote for history buffs, comedians, and inventors alike. While no modern homeowner is clamoring for a bathtub with wheels, the idea of flexible bathing spaces is making a quiet comeback in small apartments, modular homes, and eco-friendly designs. Compact soaking tubs that can be drained and moved, inflatable spa baths, and Japanese-style deep tubs with temperature control are nods, intentional or not, to the Victorian dream of making bathing fit the bather, not the other way around. Of course, they come with modern plumbing and a lower chance of accidentally colliding with your cat. The rolling bathtub may never make a full comeback, and the insurance industry is no doubt grateful, but its oddball charm has earned it a permanent spot in the pantheon of historical curiosities. It's a reminder that invention is often as much about imagination as practicality, that for every steam engine or telegraph there's a wheel tub lurking in the wings, waiting to prove that human creativity knows no bounds, even when it's soap-scented and slightly ridiculous. Or, to put it another way, it may be gone, but it rolled so we could soak. Picture it, China, somewhere between the 12th and 13th centuries, a world without filters, polarized lenses, or even the faintest whiff of SPF 50. Nobody's working on their tan because the very idea of voluntarily lying in the sun was about as fashionable as licking a street lantern. In fact, in the strict social hierarchy of medieval China, being tanned meant one thing: you worked outside. And if you worked outside, you weren't rich, influential, or sitting in court passing judgment on others. So no, sunglasses weren't a beach accessory. They were a courtroom weapon. Yes, that's right. The first sunglasses were for judges. Not rock stars, not popes, not emperors in the imperial garden. Judges. And not because the courtrooms had bad glare from all the shimmering silks. No, these shades were to hide expressions. Now you might be wondering, why hide your face if you're a judge? After all, aren't judges supposed to have that perfect poker face anyway? True, but here's the thing. Human faces are snitches. You can try to be unreadable, but the tiniest twitch of the mouth or narrowing of the eyes can give everything away. And in the high-stakes atmosphere of medieval justice, the last thing you wanted was for the accused or the accuser to see the faint smirk that says, "This story is ridiculous," or the micro-expression that whispers, "I've already decided you're guilty." So instead of practicing their poker face in the mirror every morning, Chinese judges had a shortcut. They simply wore sunglasses. Well, not glasses in the sense we think of them. There were no arms hooking over the ears, no metal frames, and certainly no slick Ray-Ban branding. These were flat panels of smoky quartz, dark, slightly translucent slices of stone, polished smooth enough to see through, but still opaque enough to obscure the eyes. They were held in place in front of the eyes by a simple frame, and voila, instant mystery. Think about it. The accused is trembling before you, spilling their alibi like a nervous soup vendor defending his broth quality. Behind your smoky quartz shades, you could be rolling your eyes or glaring holes in their soul, and they'd have no idea. Justice stayed blind because the judge's eyes were literally hidden. This was more than a gimmick. In a time when trials could be influenced by wealth, status, and personal bias, hiding the judge's facial cues added a layer of impartiality, or at least the appearance of it. Whether it actually prevented bias is another question, but it certainly kept defendants guessing. And here's where the design was brilliant. Smoky quartz doesn't distort vision too badly. Sure, the world looked a bit dimmer, like permanent twilight, but you could still read documents, inspect evidence, and look your fellow court officials square in the face, all without letting them read your face. It was basically medieval facial encryption. Of course, wearing these shades probably came with side effects. For one, imagine having to maintain a stern, authoritative voice while the world looked like it was trapped inside a sepia-toned Instagram filter. For another, smoky quartz is heavy. You're not dealing with lightweight plastic here. After a long trial, your face muscles might ache, your nose bridge might feel like it's been through a minor siege, and you'd probably have 2 faint indentations where the frame pressed against your skin. Still, that was a small price to pay for what was essentially the ultimate power accessory. In fact, I'd argue that medieval Chinese judges were the first to use fashion as a tool of intimidation in a legal setting. Forget robes, wigs, or gavels, their shades were the gavel. It's also worth noting that these glasses had nothing to do with eye health. The idea that sunlight could damage your eyes was centuries away from entering popular thought. UV rays? Completely unknown. These weren't protective, they were performative, and yet they set a precedent. People saw them and thought, authority, mystery, judgment. In short, sunglasses gained an early reputation as a sign of someone you probably shouldn't argue with. And here's the funny part, this wasn't a widespread fashion. It's not like every merchant started wearing smoky quartz shades at the market to hide their bargaining smirks. These were reserved for the courtroom, a kind of judicial uniform piece. But can you imagine the temptation? If you were a particularly cunning market vendor, wouldn't you want to wear them just to keep customers guessing about whether you were bluffing on that special price? The truth is, these early sunglasses worked because of something psychology still recognizes today. People trust less when they can't see your eyes. We use eye contact to gauge sincerity, detect lies, and read emotion. Take that away, and you've created uncertainty. And uncertainty, in court, means control stays firmly in the judge's hands. So the first sunglasses weren't cool because they shielded you from sunlight. They were cool because they shielded you from being read. They were the ultimate bluff in an era when words could be dangerous, reputations fragile, and verdicts final. Or, to put it in modern terms, they were the original deal-with-it glasses, except instead of memes, they were backed by imperial authority. Picture a courtroom in 13th century China. No mahogany-paneled walls, no powdered wigs, and certainly no buzzing fluorescent lights. Instead, you've got the faint scent of incense curling through the air, clerks in flowing robes shuffling bamboo slips of testimony, and at the very center of it all, presiding with an unnervingly unreadable face, a judge wearing what looked like 2 chunks of dark rock strapped to his head. These were the early sunglasses of the judiciary, except they weren't for stepping out onto the beach. They were for stepping into the human drama of law and order without letting a single flicker of emotion betray the verdict to come. In an era when the justice system was as much theatre as it was procedure, the Chinese judge was the ultimate performer, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The cases they oversaw could range from disputes over property boundaries to accusations of theft, adultery, or even treason. A wrong ruling could mean someone loses their land, their reputation, or in more extreme cases, their head. And in this high-pressure environment, the judge's facial expressions weren't just idle muscle twitches, they were potential leaks of power. The ancient Chinese judicial process valued impartiality, or at least the appearance of it. In theory, judges were to weigh each side carefully, guided by law and Confucian moral principles. In practice, human beings have a hard time hiding their true feelings when someone says something outrageous. Raise an eyebrow during a witness testimony, and suddenly the accused knows you think they're guilty. Let your mouth twitch into a smirk, and the defense lawyer smells blood in the water. This was especially risky in an age when trials were conducted face-to-face, in relatively small settings, where every micro-expression could be caught and interpreted. That's where the lenses came in, made of flat slabs of smoky quartz, stone dark enough to mask the eyes but light enough to see through. They acted as a literal poker face. The judge could hear shocking testimony, insulting accusations, or even hilarious mistranslations, all without giving away the slightest flicker of reaction. Witnesses couldn't read whether their story was landing well. Defendants couldn't tell if their pleas for mercy were hitting the judge's heart or bouncing off a wall of judicial apathy. It was psychological warfare, centuries before the term existed. The effect was profound. Trials became less about reading the judge's mood and more about making a coherent case. And for the judges themselves, the glasses offered a comfortable shield, even if they internally thought, wow, this guy is definitely lying through his teeth. Their external demeanor said only, I am an unfeeling slab of authority. Proceed. But there was more at play here than just keeping a straight face. These lenses also played into the politics of the court system. A judge in imperial China didn't operate in a vacuum. They were appointed by higher officials, often serving in unfamiliar provinces where they were outsiders to local politics. This made them potential targets for bribery, intimidation, or subtle manipulation. By hiding their reactions, they maintained not only authority, but also a certain mystique. An unreadable judge was a safe judge, safe from accusations of bias, safe from whispers of favoritism, and importantly, safe from being cornered by overconfident defendants who thought they'd won them over with charm. It's worth noting that in traditional Chinese philosophy, appearances carried tremendous weight. The concept of ritual propriety emphasized the importance of conduct, presentation, and the careful maintenance of dignity. A judge's face was part of that presentation. The quartz lenses weren't just a quirky accessory, they were a tool for upholding the image of unshakable Confucian authority. The message they sent was clear. This is not a man swayed by petty emotions. This is the law made flesh, and also slightly obscured by rock. Now, if you're thinking this sounds suspiciously like the mirrored sunglasses worn by modern-day poker players, you're not far off. The principle is almost identical. In high-stakes poker, you hide your eyes so no one can tell if your latest bet is backed by a royal flush or a complete disaster. In high-stakes justice, You hide your eyes so no one can tell if you're leaning toward the gallows or a walk free. Both are about controlling the flow of information, not just through what you say, but through what you refuse to reveal. There's even a certain theatricality to it. In the same way a poker pro might slowly remove their sunglasses before delivering the winning blow, an ancient judge could theoretically take off their quartz lenses just before reading the verdict, letting the defendant see their fate in the cold, unshielded eyes of the law. Whether this ever actually happened is debatable, but it's the kind of image that makes you wish it had. And make no mistake, this was a power move. Glasses in medieval China weren't a dime a dozen accessory you could grab at a market stall. They were specialized, carefully made, and tied to authority. Seeing someone wearing them in a court was like seeing a police officer in mirrored aviators. It didn't just block the glare, it projected a certain untouchable status. In the end, the smoky quartz lenses of Chinese judges weren't about style, fashion, or eye health. They were about control. Control over perception, control over the flow of the trial, and control over the narrative. In a system where the law could be both a shield and a sword, these lenses ensured the hand that held it remained steady, unreadable, and above all, untouchable, because even in the 13th century, people knew how to play their cards close to their chest, or in this case, close to their face. When we picture medieval eyewear, we often imagine something clunky and primitive, wooden frames, thick glass, and a design aesthetic best described as prototype gone wrong. But the first Chinese sunglasses of the 12th and 13th centuries were surprisingly refined for their purpose. They weren't meant to shade your eyes from sunlight or improve your vision. No, they were meant to hide the twitch of an eyebrow, the faint curl of a lip, or the telltale narrowing of a gaze. In other words, fashion accessories for poker-face justice. The magic material of choice? Smoky quartz, forget tinted polycarbonate, or sleek mirrored coatings. Medieval Chinese craftsmen took hunks of naturally occurring quartz with a grey-brown hue, then carefully ground and polished them into flat, slightly curved discs. These weren't your precision-cut optical wonders. They were more like nature's own sunglasses, brought into the world without a single patent dispute. Smoky quartz had two qualities that made it perfect for judicial concealment. First, its tint was dark enough to obscure the wearer's eyes from the outside world. Second, it was just translucent enough for the wearer to see through mostly. And here's where the fun begins. These lenses distorted reality ever so slightly. They didn't sharpen details, they softened them like a medieval Instagram filter no one asked for. The result was a muted, dim view of the courtroom. Perfect if your goal was to appear above petty human emotions. Less perfect if you wanted to avoid accidentally sentencing a bystander to hard labor because you mistook them for the defendant. The making of these quartz spectacles required a careful blend of skill and patience. Step 1. Find a decent chunk of smoky quartz, not too cloudy, unless you wanted to look like you were judging a case through a snowstorm, not too clear because that defeated the point. The stone was cut into thin slices, smoothed into uniform discs, and polished to reduce flaws. If you're imagining an artisan bent over a table with a diamond-tipped lathe, stop. This was labor-intensive, hand-driven work using abrasives like fine sand, water, and cloth. Polishing a single lens could take days. Frames were equally minimal. They were often made from simple metal wire or carved from bone, ivory, or wood. No nose pads, no adjustable arms. Comfort wasn't the goal. This was about presence. When a judge slid those frames over his eyes, it wasn't to relax, it was to announce, I am no mere man, I am the embodiment of the law, and also you can't tell if I'm secretly rolling my eyes at you. To modern wearers used to anti-glare coatings and precision refractive corrections, these quartz sunglasses would feel like looking at the world through a tinted bathroom window. They didn't block UV rays, they didn't magnify or focus, they didn't even guarantee color accuracy. Red robes might look brown, green silks might turn grayish, and the food on the court table might become unrecognizable mush, but that was fine. The point wasn't to see better, it was to see without being seen. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of one-way glass, only in wearable form. They gave judges a small but significant psychological edge in the courtroom. Litigants couldn't read their expressions, and that alone could make testimony more nervous, more revealing, or more desperate. In this way, the lenses didn't just distort light, they subtly bent the arc of justice itself. Fast forward to today, and eyewear has gone through revolutions in both materials and design. Modern sunglasses might use polycarbonate lenses, lightweight titanium frames, and specialized tints to enhance contrast or block harmful rays. The smoky quartz lenses of medieval China would seem crude by comparison. But they had one feature modern glasses rarely match: an aura of mystique. Today's poker players sometimes wear dark wraparounds to keep opponents from spotting a twitch or a flicker in their eyes. Celebrity douse jades to hide exhaustion or disdain. Police officers use mirrored aviators to project authority. In their own way, those 13th century quartz spectacles were the blueprint for an entire tradition of using eyewear as a shield, not from the sun but from scrutiny. It's easy to imagine the absurdity of the situation. A judge sitting in a dim, crowded courtroom, peering at you through lenses that block neither the sun nor the possibility of a wrongful fine, all while projecting an air of unshakable impartiality. Imagine sunglasses, you might say, that do absolutely nothing for your vision and absolutely everything for your legal poker face. And somehow, that's exactly why they worked. The first Chinese sunglasses didn't change the laws of optics, they changed the laws of perception. And in an age when a flicker of emotion could sway a verdict, smoky quartz might have been the most powerful judicial tool since the gavel. In the rigidly hierarchical world of medieval China, very few fashion statements traveled far beyond their original niche. Silk robes were for the elite. Jade pendants were for those who could afford to hire someone else to worry about their rice harvest. And dark-tinted eyewear, first associated with the severe and solemn world of imperial courtrooms, should have stayed there. But like all good accessories, it eventually slipped the leash of officialdom and found its way onto the noses of people who had no intention of deciding life or death verdicts. Once you strip away the judicial authority, you're left with something rather enticing, an accessory that was rare, striking, and vaguely mysterious. In a society where appearances were everything, these smoky-lensed spectacles had a certain magnetic pull. For the nobility, it was less about hiding impartiality and more about projecting an aura of inscrutable wisdom, even if the deepest decision they'd make that day was whether to have duck or fish for dinner. Scholars, in particular, found them appealing, not because they needed them to read. The lenses, as we've established, didn't actually help you see better, but because of the associations. Dark-tinted glasses suggested a mind so bright it needed shading. A Confucian scholar sitting in a courtyard, quoting the Analects while peering through polished quartz, could create an almost mythic image, a living embodiment of quiet dignity and intellect. Did the glasses make the man look more brilliant, or did the man make the glasses look more philosophical? It hardly mattered. The effect was complete. Beyond the cloisters of academia and the private halls of nobility, there is tantalizing evidence that certain performers took a shine to tinted lenses. It makes sense. Theatrical culture in China had a deep appreciation for costume, symbolism, and transformation. A court entertainer arriving in tinted spectacles could instantly evoke intrigue, lending an air of foreign exoticism or magical capability. Theatrical makeup already relied heavily on exaggerating facial expressions. Eyewear could add yet another layer of artifice, masking the eyes entirely and forcing the audience to focus on the voice, movement, and costume. In short, they made you watch the performance instead of reading the face. Ceremonial uses, too, might have played a part. The imperial court often blurred the line between governance and pageantry, and certain rituals required participants to embody specific roles: the wise advisor, the impartial arbiter, the exotic envoy from afar. In such contexts, dark-tinted glasses could work as a prop, signaling a role that transcended ordinary human concerns. You weren't just a person, you were an idea in human form, shielded from the messy glare of mortal affairs. Of course, in some cases, Tinted glasses were probably just another elite novelty, the same way a noble might own a foreign chess set they couldn't actually play. Having something unusual was in itself a display of wealth and status. The materials, smoky quartz, carefully shaped and polished, were not exactly growing on the nearest mulberry tree, and the craftsmanship required meant that each pair was a luxury item, the kind of thing you could pass down as a family heirloom or, more provocatively, wear to a banquet just to see who noticed. There's also the possibility that wearing such glasses outside of a courtroom sent a subtle social signal. I move in the circles where judges walk. That kind of indirect association could lend someone a measure of gravitas, just as wearing a military-style coat might today, even if you've never been closer to a battlefield than a chessboard. In an age when social mobility was difficult, dressing the part was sometimes the first, if not the only step toward being treated like you belonged in the higher tiers of society. Interestingly, by appearing on both the stern faces of judges and the smiling faces of jesters, tinted glasses took on a peculiar dual symbolism. On one hand, they conveyed seriousness and detachment. On the other, they could become part of a playful, exaggerated costume. That flexibility made them even more fascinating, because it's rare for a single object to bridge the worlds of power and entertainment so seamlessly. And then there's the purely human factor. Once something becomes associated with authority, people inevitably try it on just to see how it feels. The same way children slip into their parents' oversized shoes, an ambitious merchant or low-ranking official might don a pair of tinted spectacles to feel, for a moment, the weight and thrill of being someone important. Maybe they even practiced their "I know something you don't" look in the mirror, because when you've got a pair of shades, every entrance is a dramatic entrance. Whether you're there to deliver a verdict, recite a poem, perform a dance, or just stroll into the marketplace, the effect is the same. Heads turn, whispers start, and suddenly you're not just a person walking, you're an event arriving. The history of early tinted eyewear has all the ingredients for a global fashion sensation: exotic materials, mysterious functions, and a dash of judicial drama. And yet, unlike silk or porcelain, smoky quartz spectacles never became a hot export item. They remained a peculiarly Chinese curiosity, cherished in certain courts and almost invisible everywhere else. The question isn't just why they were invented, it's why they stayed where they were, refusing to make the leap into the wardrobes, courtrooms, and marketplaces of other civilizations. Part of the answer is painfully practical. They were expensive. Smoky quartz was not the kind of stone you could casually scoop out of a stream bed. It had to be quarried, transported, and worked by artisans skilled enough to slice and polish it without shattering the entire piece. In an age without modern abrasives or precision grinding tools, the process was long, delicate, and ruinously costly. For the average merchant or farmer, owning a pair would have been about as realistic as buying a gold-plated plough. Even wealthy individuals thought twice before commissioning them, especially when there were more immediately impressive luxuries: embroidered robes, jade ornaments, gold-inlaid chopsticks that didn't also make you look like you'd just joined an experimental theatre troupe. Then there's the question of purpose. In China, tinted eyewear fits snugly into a very specific cultural and professional niche: the courtroom. Judges used them not as sun protection, but as a kind of visual poker face, a way to keep their eyes hidden while listening to testimony, much like a modern-day interrogator leaning back in the shadows. Outside of that context, however, their appeal was murkier. A farmer in France or a merchant in Cairo wouldn't see much use for quartz-tinted peepers that made your vision slightly dimmer and fuzzier. In fact, for people working outdoors, they offered no real protection against the actual sun, which continued to beam down with the same relentless enthusiasm regardless of how you accessorized. This functional mismatch meant there was no natural reason for them to be adopted abroad. Sunglasses as we know them today didn't take off globally until they were linked to practical needs like glare reduction, driving comfort, and eventually celebrity image control. In the 12th century, however, there was no paparazzi problem, no car windshields, and precious few situations where squinting was seen as a moral failing. Trade limitations also played their part. China's luxury exports in the medieval period tended toward products that had universal appeal. Silk, porcelain, tea, lacquerware. Even the most eccentric of these items, say a lacquered box shaped like a duck, still had some functional purpose. Tinted quartz spectacles were so culturally specific that even traders who encountered them might not have understood what they were for. Imagine being a Venetian merchant already juggling silk tariffs and spice prices when someone hands you a pair of nearly opaque crystal ovals on a frame. Would you invest valuable cargo space in something you couldn't explain to your customers without a 40-minute lecture? Probably not. Nor did the eyewear's aesthetic help much. While smoky quartz has a subtle beauty, its dark tint could easily be mistaken for dullness or dirtiness to the untrained eye. There's also the problem that medieval fashion tastes didn't necessarily translate across cultures. A visual cue that screamed serious and authoritative in a Song dynasty courtroom might just look odd and mildly suspicious in a Genoese port. Another obstacle was technological. The craftsmanship required to cut and polish quartz to an optically usable smoothness wasn't something you could casually replicate in another country without the right tools, skills, and supply chains. Even if a foreign ruler decided they wanted some for themselves, producing them locally would involve training artisans in an entirely new discipline. It's one thing to set a gem into a crown, it's another to turn that gem into a functional lens. There's also an irony to consider. Part of the eyewear's charm in China was its mystique, the subtle intimidation it lent to court proceedings. Spread too far, and that mystique would inevitably dilute. If everyone from royal judges to street jugglers started wearing smoky quartz shades, they'd lose their air of gravitas and become just another accessory. Their exclusivity was their power, and that exclusivity required them to remain rare. By the time global trade networks began to expand enough for such an item to potentially travel farther afield, the world had already moved on. Europe was developing its own traditions of glass-making and spectacle crafting. Starting with clear lenses for monks and scholars, the demand was for tools that corrected vision, not ones that introduced deliberate distortion. Tinted eyewear would eventually make its way into the European scene, but centuries later, and for entirely different reasons, namely, protecting the eyes from glare or looking like a 1920s film star. In short, smoky quartz judicial spectacles were the perfect example of a niche accessory. They had a place, a purpose, and a cultural logic that made perfect sense in their original setting, but like gold-plated fountain pens or monogrammed falcon hoods, they weren't destined to become global essentials. They stayed where they belonged, admired by those in the know and baffling to everyone else. Or, to put it in modern marketing terms, they were an exclusive limited edition drop, centuries before streetwear made that concept cool. And like all the best limited editions, they didn't try to please everyone. They simply sat there, darkly gleaming in the eyes of a stern-faced judge who was absolutely not telling you whether you were about to win your case or lose your farm. If the Chinese judiciary had been quietly judging people through smoky-tinted lenses for centuries, Europe as usual took its time to notice. In fact, when tinted eyewear finally began creeping into the West, it wasn't through an avalanche of cultural exchange, but more like an awkward introduction at a party. Oh, you have dark glass. Interesting. So what's that for? The earliest confirmed Western encounters with tinted lenses don't seem to come from trade caravans hauling crates of sunglasses across the Silk Road, but rather from the slow trickle of information that comes when empires politely, and sometimes not so politely, poke at one another. By the 17th century, Jesuit missionaries and European merchants had witnessed all sorts of unusual East Asian objects, porcelain, tea, intricate lacquerware, but eyewear didn't rank high on their must-import list. It was only when lens making in Europe itself reached a comfortable level of craftsmanship that the idea of altering the glass color even became a possibility worth testing. And here's the kicker. When Europeans did start experimenting with tinted lenses, they weren't thinking, yes, the Chinese way of keeping a poker face in court. No, they were thinking about diseased eyeballs. The earliest Western tinted glasses were, more often than not prescribed for people with highly sensitive eyes, cataracts, or other conditions where bright sunlight or harsh candlelight was more than just a nuisance. They weren't cool, they were medical devices. Imagine wearing them to a tavern and instead of getting admiring glances, people whisper, "Poor soul, can't even look at the roast without squinting." The choice of tint in Europe wasn't purely about style either. There was actual pseudoscience involved. Physicians believed that certain colors could soothe the eyes or help heal them. Green lenses, for example, were thought to be calming, while blue lenses might ease headaches. Whether these worked or not is debatable. Spoiler, they mostly didn't. But it shows that Europeans were filtering the idea of tinted lenses through their own priorities, namely, turning everything into a medical recommendation. This cultural mismatch was profound. In China, the early tinted lens tradition we've discussed was about anonymity, authority, and status, a social tool wrapped in symbolism. In Europe, it was about function and health. A Chinese official might have worn tinted lenses to project dignity while passing judgment. A European gentleman wore them because his doctor told him his optic nerves needed a holiday. There were, of course, occasional forays into fashion. Venice, with its thriving glass-making industry, experimented with colored spectacles in the 18th century, but these were often novelty items rather than status markers. Wealthy collectors of oddities might own a pair, but the idea of striding into a salon with dark lenses to make an impression, that wouldn't hit its stride for well over a century. The fact that the technology existed but the cultural desire didn't is telling. Europe had the glassmakers. They had the metalworkers to make frames. They even had the perfect environment for tinted eyewear to be useful. Just ask anyone who's tried to cross a snow-covered alpine pass without being blinded. But without the symbolic weight tinted glasses carried in Chinese courtrooms, there simply wasn't enough incentive to popularize them. We can also thank the limited flow of specialized knowledge for this slow uptake. In the 1600s and 1700s, global trade was robust in spices, textiles, and art. But something as niche as a judicial accessory, that just wasn't making it onto East India Company shipping manifests. You could get your hands on a silk robe from Guangzhou, but a pair of smoky quartz judge's lenses, that required a level of cultural curiosity that wasn't exactly the strong suit of the average European aristocrat. When tinted lenses did start appearing more widely in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were almost entirely divorced from their original Eastern symbolism. Instead, they were often marketed alongside other optical oddities, like monocles or reading stones. They were the domain of eccentric physicians, the wealthy hypochondriac, and the occasional scholar who claimed that tinted glasses improved concentration, because nothing says serious thinker like turning the world an ominous shade of brown. The funniest part? By the time Europeans began adopting tinted lenses for fashion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they didn't even realize they were reinventing a centuries-old concept. The swagger of a 1920s movie star stepping off a train in round, dark shades was, in a very real sense, the spiritual descendant of the Chinese magistrate glaring down from the bench in tinted quartz. The difference is that the magistrate wasn't posing for a magazine cover, though given the right lighting he absolutely could have. So yes, Europe saw tinted lenses and thought, nice, now how do we make them weird? The answer, make them about medicine. Sprinkle in a dash of Venice's glass-making flair. Ignore the centuries of symbolic use in China. By the 18th century, human civilization had gotten a little brighter. Literally, cities were installing oil lamps and later gas lights. Polished glass and mirrors were becoming more affordable, and scientific instruments like telescopes and microscopes were suddenly pointed at both the heavens and the tiny creatures crawling around in your drinking water. All of this was wonderful for progress, and terrible for your eyes. For centuries, tinted lenses had been a curiosity tucked away in Chinese imperial courts or among specialized trades. Now the age of enlightenment was about to give them a makeover. The story begins with the people least interested in fashion, scientists. In the 1700s, natural philosophers, which is what scientists called themselves before scientist was invented, began experimenting with lenses to filter out specific wavelengths of light. This was particularly important for astronomers. Spend a few hours staring at the sun's corona through a telescope without adequate eye protection, and you'll find yourself with a new hobby, navigating your home by touch. Early tinted spectacles helped reduce glare during observations, though they still had a ways to go before anyone could claim them as true sunglasses. Travelers soon joined the list of enthusiasts. Long-distance voyages were becoming more common thanks to improved navigation and bigger ships, but bright glare off the ocean was no joke. Sailors and explorers began to dabble in tinted eyewear, not yet as a standard part of the kit, but enough to plant the seed for future innovation. A pair of smoky lenses might not save you from scurvy, but they could at least make the endless reflection of sunlight on water less blinding. The 18th century also gave rise to another class of light-sensitive professionals, early photographers. The camera obscura and its chemical descendants didn't just require skill, they demanded patience under glaring daylight. Some photographers adopted tinted glasses for comfort, and though their designs were crude by modern standards, the principle was there: reduce the intensity of light without turning the world into a dark blur. Meanwhile, across Europe, the medical establishment had its own reasons for playing with tinted lenses. Physicians began prescribing them for conditions such as weak eyes, ocular fatigue, and photophobia, a catch-all term for light sensitivity. These were not your stylish tortoiseshell shades. Most were round-lensed and framed in plain wire, designed more to make you look like an 18th century librarian than a fashion icon. But for patients with conditions like syphilitic eye disease or cataracts, they could make a significant difference. The real shift came in the 19th century, an era in which light got dramatically brighter in public spaces. Gas lighting and later early electric bulbs changed nightlife from candlelit coziness to something much closer to daylight. Alongside this, industrialization brought wide streets, glass-fronted buildings, and new ways for sunlight to bounce around urban environments. For people sensitive to glare, tinted glasses were no longer just a curiosity, they were a small but growing necessity. And then came the Victorians. No society on earth could take a purely practical invention and wrap it in layers of aesthetic judgment quite like them. By the mid-1800s, eyewear had entered the realm of personal style. Tinted spectacles were still rare, but they began to appear in catalogues aimed at the genteel classes, marketed as accessories for those who traveled or spent leisure time outdoors. You could now choose between lightly smoked for strolling in the park, amber for hunting, or green for fishing. Each shade claimed a different advantage, though how much was science and how much was marketing is still up for debate. The Edwardian era continued the trend, with tinted glasses making cautious appearances among holidaymakers visiting seaside resorts. Photographs from the early 1900s show fashionable women in long skirts and parasols, occasionally sporting a pair of dainty tinted pince-nez. The look said, "I am sophisticated enough to protect my complexion from the sun and my retinas from glare." The practicality was there, but the style was now just as important. Still, this was not yet the sunglasses revolution. The average person in London, Paris, or New York was far more likely to squint through a sunny day than invest in tinted spectacles. Cost, limited supply, and the lingering association with medical conditions kept them from becoming truly mainstream. Yet the groundwork had been laid for the first time in centuries. Tinted eyewear had a clear place both in science and in style. The irony? It had taken humanity roughly 5 centuries to fully realize that sunglasses were great for actually blocking sunlight outdoors. From Chinese courtrooms to European laboratories, the path was anything but direct. But by the dawn of the 20th century, we were finally ready for tinted lenses to leave the laboratory and step onto the boardwalk, where they'd eventually become the ultimate statement accessory, or, to put it another way, only took 500 years to figure out that sunglasses work outside too. The medieval Chinese judges who first donned smoky quartz lenses probably had no idea they were setting off a cultural chain reaction that would ripple across centuries. Their goal wasn't to block the glare of the sun or to look effortlessly cool. It was to keep their facial expressions hidden in court. After all, justice wasn't just blind, it was also unreadable. Fast forward nearly 1,000 years, and those same principles, mystery, authority, and a touch of intimidation still lie at the heart of why people reach for a pair of sunglasses. Today, sunglasses are everywhere, from airport duty-free shops to high-end Paris catwalks, yet their symbolic weight far outstrips their practical function. They are shields, masks, statements, and sometimes even weapons of psychological warfare. In this way, the legacy of those first opaque lenses has less to do with UV protection and more to do with what it means to keep your eyes, your most human expressive feature, hidden. Humans instinctively look to someone's eyes for truth. Our pupils dilate with emotion, our gaze shifts when we're lying, and micro-expressions flicker faster than we can control. By covering the eyes, sunglasses don't just block light, they block information. This makes them perfect for anyone who needs to maintain a strategic edge. Poker players know this. In a game where the tiniest twitch can cost you thousands, mirrored aviators become as valuable as the chips on the table. Celebrities know it too. Stepping off a plane in dark shades means controlling the narrative before the tabloids do. Even interrogators and negotiators have found the trick useful. When the person across from you can't tell what you're thinking, they're the ones squirming. And so the ancient Chinese judges' poker face lenses live on in countless situations where information control is key. In the 20th century, sunglasses took an unexpected leap from tool to fashion icon. Hollywood played a major role. Think Audrey Hepburn's oversized shades in Breakfast at Tiffany's, or Tom Cruise's Ray-Ban Wayfarers in Risky Business. On screen and off, sunglasses became shorthand for cool, a look that says, "I'm unbothered, mysterious, and possibly too famous to talk to you." Designers noticed. By the mid-century, shades were appearing not just on faces but in fashion spreads, ad campaigns, and even art installations. Their role had expanded. No longer purely functional, they became extensions of personality. You could wear them to project rebellion, glamour, athleticism, or sheer eccentricity. And yet, underneath the gloss of fashion photography, the basic idea hadn't changed since the days of the Ming dynasty. Hide the eyes, hold the power. The modern world has taken this legacy in new directions. Sunglasses in the 21st century serve double duty, protecting from the sun's rays and protecting from the lens of someone's iPhone. They've become the perfect armor for a time when a candid photo can end up online in seconds. Athletes wear them to avoid giving away fatigue or frustration during competition. Politicians use them when they want to appear strong, collected, or ironically relatable, while flipping burgers at a campaign barbecue. Influencers choose them carefully, knowing a statement pair of shades can make an entire outfit go viral. We may live in a world of radical visibility, but sunglasses remain one of the few tools that let us control what others see. Psychologists talk about the information gap, the idea that when we can't see or know something, our brains fill in the blanks, often assuming the hidden truth is more interesting or important than it might actually be. This is why a celebrity in sunglasses instantly seems more intriguing than the same person without them. The same principle explains why villains in films often wear dark glasses indoors. They don't have to be hiding anything, they just need you to wonder what they're hiding. That uncertainty alone can tip the balance in an interaction. In essence, sunglasses are the modern-day equivalent of the knight's visor, the tribal mask, or the emperor's heavy silk veil, a barrier between you and the other person's judgment. When you strip away the modern branding, UV-blocking science, and Instagram filters, the DNA of the very first sunglasses is still visible. From the judges of medieval China to today's red carpet premieres, the reasons for wearing shades often boil down to the same thing: controlling perception. The medieval court lenses were opaque. They didn't help vision, and they certainly weren't for style, but they set in motion a cultural understanding that covering the eyes can influence power dynamics. That legacy has survived wars, fashion revolutions, and the invention of indoor lighting. And perhaps the most amusing part, despite all our modern sophistication, we still haven't outgrown the basic human fascination with someone whose eyes we can't see. Because whether you're a poker champion, a rock star, a prime minister, or just someone pretending to be all three while waiting in line for coffee. Sometimes the best move really is to keep them guessing.